There comes a moment in every soul's journey when the theater of the false self can no longer contain the magnitude of what seeks to be born. It is not a moment chosen by the conscious mind, for the ego would never willingly relinquish its carefully constructed stage. Rather, it arrives like dawn after the longest night, inevitable, quiet, and utterly transformative. She stands now at the edge of this recognition, feeling the weight of 10,000 performances pressing against her chest like stones gathered from an ancient riverbed. Each performance a small death, each applause a temporary resurrection that never quite filled the hollow spaces within. The spotlight that once seemed to promise warmth now reveals itself as the harsh illumination of judgment, casting shadows that stretch longer than her authentic self has ever been allowed to grow. How long had she been dancing this dance? How many years had she spent in rehearsal for a love that would only arrive if she performed it into existence? The questions themselves feel like blasphemy against the religion of her proving, yet they persist, echoing in the chambers of her heart with the insistence of truth that can no longer be silenced. In Jung's understanding of the psyche, the persona, that mask we wear for the world, begins as protection, but often becomes a prison. She feels the weight of this mask now, carved from the expectations of others, painted with the colors they found pleasing, shaped to fit their comfort rather than her truth. The persona that once felt like armor now feels like a second skin. She has outgrown, tight and suffocating, preventing the natural expansion of her being. The audience sits before her, these familiar faces that have grown accustomed to her endless auditions for their approval. They lean forward in their seats, unconsciously expecting the next act, the next proof of her worthiness to occupy space in their lives. But something fundamental has shifted in the atmospheric pressure of her soul. The desire to please, once so intense it felt like hunger, now feels foreign, as if it belongs to someone she used to be but can barely remember. This is the beginning of what the ancients called Enantiodromia, the tendency of things to transform into their opposite when they reach their extreme. Her excessive giving is beginning to reveal its shadow, the profound self-abandonment that masquerades as love. Her endless availability is showing its dark face, the complete absence of sacred boundaries that protect the holy ground of the self. She begins to see, with the clarity that comes only through psychic exhaustion, that she has been offering herself as sacrifice on the altar of others' comfort. Not from genuine love, but from a desperate need to earn her place in a world that taught her, through 1,000 small wounds, that her value was contingent upon her usefulness. The realization moves through her like water through parched earth. She has been both actor and audience in a tragedy of her own making, applauding her own dissolution while believing it was connection. The roles she has played, the ever-giving mother, the crisis-solving friend, the emotional therapist to those who never asked about her own wounds. These roles were not chosen from abundance, but from scarcity, from the terrifying belief that, without them, she would not be chosen at all. In this moment of recognition, she feels the presence of what Jung called the self, that deeper, wiser aspect of consciousness that transcends the ego's desperate machinations. It speaks not in words, but in the sudden absence of the familiar anxiety that has driven her performances. It speaks in the stillness that settles over her like snow, over a landscape that has been too long disturbed by unnecessary motion. The audience grows restless. They sense the change before she has even moved. There is something different in her stance, something that suggests she might not deliver the familiar comfort they have come to expect. The energy that once radiated from her in endless waves, seeking constantly to soothe, to fix, to provide. This energy is gathering itself back to its source like a tide that has finally decided to return to the sea. She thinks of the countless times she has contorted herself into shapes that pleased others, her authentic responses edited and revised until they bore no resemblance to her truth. The laughter that came too quickly, covering discomfort, the agreements that felt like small betrayals of her inner knowing, the enthusiasm manufactured to match others' energy, even when her soul craved silence. Each modification of her natural self had seemed so small, so reasonable, so loving, but accumulated across years, they had built a prison of pretense that now feels unbearable. The shadow of this pattern begins to reveal itself, not as something to be eliminated, but as something to be understood with the compassion reserved for wounded children. She sees now that her proving had never been about love at all, but about terror. Terror of abandonment, terror of being seen as insufficient, terror of the silence that might remain if she stopped filling every void with her desperate energy. But what if that silence was not emptiness, but fullness? What if the space that remained when she stopped performing was not absence, but presence, her own presence, finally given room to breathe? The theater around her begins to feel different. The seats that once seemed to demand her constant attention now appear as what they have always been, places where others sit to witness, not to judge. The stage that felt like a courtroom now reveals itself as simply a space, neither inherently demanding nor condemning, but neutral, waiting to hold whatever truth chooses to emerge. She feels the familiar impulse rise within her, the automatic response to perform, to prove, to provide whatever seems to be wanted. But for the first time, she does not act upon it immediately. She lets the impulse exist without becoming it, watching it with the curiosity of someone observing a wild animal from a safe distance. The impulse is not her, she realizes. It is simply a pattern carved by old wounds, maintained by old fears. The silence stretches longer than it ever has before. In this silence, she begins to hear something she has not heard in years, the sound of her own breathing, unperformed and unedited. The sound of her own heartbeat, keeping time not to others' rhythms, but to the ancient drum that has always lived within her chest. This is the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who one truly is beneath the accumulated layers of adaptation and performance. It is not a comfortable process, for it requires the death of the familiar false self before the authentic self can be born. She feels this death beginning now, not as destruction but as liberation, like a snake finally ready to shed skin that has become too small. The audience shifts uncomfortably. They have come to depend upon her performances, not out of malice, but out of unconsciousness. They have grown accustomed to the emotional labor she provides, the way she smooths all rough edges, the way she anticipates needs before they are spoken, the way she carries the emotional weight that others do not wish to bear. Her potential withdrawal threatens not their love for her, but their comfort, their convenience, their ability to remain unconscious of their own inner work. But she is beginning to understand that their discomfort is not her responsibility. This understanding arrives not as cruelty but as wisdom, not as rejection, but as the first stirring of genuine self-love. She cannot love others authentically while abandoning herself. She cannot give from a well that she has never allowed to fill. The spotlight that has illuminated her performances begins to feel different. Instead of revealing her for judgment, it now simply illuminates what is present. And what is present, she realizes with wonder, is enough. Not because she has finally performed perfectly, but because the need to perform perfectly is beginning to dissolve like mist in morning sunlight. She feels the presence of all the women who have come before her, who have faced this same moment of recognition, the moment when the cost of proving becomes greater than the fear of not proving, the moment when the exhaustion of performance outweighs the terror of being seen as insufficient. She is not alone in this moment, though she stands upon the stage as an individual. She carries within her the collective wisdom of all who have chosen authenticity over approval, truth over comfort. The curtain begins to fall, though she has not signaled for it. It falls of its own accord, drawn by the gravitational pull of endings that have been too long delayed. The audience sits in stunned silence, not yet understanding that they are witnessing not a failure, but a birth. They came for a performance and instead received an initiation, though they will not recognize it as such for some time to come. As the heavy fabric descends between her and those who have watched her performances, she feels not loss but relief so profound it nearly brings her to her knees. The relief of finally setting down a weight she did not realize she was carrying. The relief of finally allowing the authentic self to take up space without permission, without apology, without endless justification for its existence. In the darkness, behind the fallen curtain, she stands in silence for the first time in years. Not the silence of waiting for applause, but the silence of completion. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of fullness finally allowed to be still. This is her last performance, not because she will never again engage with others, but because she will never again abandon herself in service of others' comfort. She will never again edit her truth until it becomes palatable to those who have not done their own inner work. She will never again sacrifice her authenticity on the altar of others' approval. The theater of her false self is closing, not in defeat, but in graduation. The audience will eventually disperse, some disappointed, some confused, some secretly relieved to witness someone finally choosing truth over performance. They will return to their own lives, their own theaters, their own stages. Some will begin to question their own performances. Others will search for a new performer to fill the void her authenticity has left behind. But she will not return to this stage. Not because she has become cruel or uncaring, but because she has finally learned the difference between love and proving, between connection and performance, between giving and self-abandonment. The woman who emerges from behind this fallen curtain will be fundamentally different from the one who has been performing for so long. She will be more herself than she has ever been, and therefore more capable of genuine love than she ever imagined possible. The last echo of applause fades into memory. The lights dim on this chapter of her journey, but in the darkness, something new is beginning to stir, something that has been waiting patiently for its turn to be born. Something that knows its own worth without needing to prove it, that knows its own voice without needing approval to speak it. The performance is over. The authentic life is about to begin. In the days following her final performance, she discovers something both terrifying and sacred, the art of taking her energy back. Not in anger, not in punishment, but in the same way a river might change its course after centuries of flowing toward a sea that has forgotten to receive its gifts with gratitude. This withdrawal is not the petulant withholding of a wounded child, but the conscious reclamation of life force by a soul that has finally recognized its own worth. It moves through her with the inevitability of seasons changing, the natural rhythm of expansion followed by necessary contraction, the eternal dance between giving and receiving that she has spent years performing only one half of. She begins to notice the countless ways her energy has been flowing outward like water, through holes she never knew existed. The immediate response to every text message, as if her availability were a debt she owed to the world. The automatic offering of solutions to problems she was never asked to solve. The emotional labor that flowed from her like breath, so constant, so unconscious, that she had forgotten it was a choice rather than an obligation. Jung spoke of libido, not merely as sexual energy, but as the fundamental life force that animates the psyche. She feels this force gathering itself back to its source now, like scattered mercury finding its way back to wholeness. For so long, this precious energy had been hemorrhaging through wounds she had learned to call love, bleeding out through boundaries that had been worn so thin they had become invisible. The silence where her voice once filled every void becomes a presence unto itself. Those accustomed to her constant reassurance, her immediate availability, her inexhaustible capacity to hold their discomfort, they begin to sense something shifting in the fundamental architecture of their relationship to her. The phone calls that once came with the confidence of guaranteed answer now ring into a space that feels different, more selective, more intentional. She discovers that saying nothing is sometimes the most powerful form of speech. Where once she would have rushed to fill uncomfortable silences with words of comfort, explanations, or solutions, she now allows these silences to exist. She watches, with the fascination of an anthropologist, as others squirm in the spaces her words once occupied. The discomfort they feel is not her cruelty, but their own relationship to emptiness, their own fear of sitting with unresolved tension. This withdrawal reveals the profound unconsciousness that had characterized so many of her relationships. She sees now how others had grown accustomed to her overflow, positioning themselves at the mouth of her generosity, like vessels that expected to be filled without ever questioning whether they had anything to offer in return. The reciprocity she had assumed was present reveals itself to have been largely imaginary, a projection of her own giving nature onto those who had learned to receive without consciousness of the gift. The great withdrawal is not punishment, but education, both for herself and for those who had unconsciously consumed her energy. It is the wise conservation of resources that the natural world demonstrates with every season. Trees do not give their leaves to winter. They draw their energy inward, protecting the essence that will birth new growth when the time is right. She is learning this ancient wisdom in her bones, in her breath, in the way she now pauses before responding to others' immediate needs. She begins to understand that her endless availability had not been love, but enabling, not just of others' unconsciousness, but of her own fundamental disconnection from her inner life. By constantly attending to external needs, she had created a life of such busyness, such outward focus, that she had become a stranger to herself. The withdrawal forces her to face this stranger, to sit with the woman she had abandoned in service of others' comfort. In the stillness that her withdrawal creates, she hears sounds that had been drowned out by the constant noise of her proving. The sound of her own needs, so long ignored that they had to shout to be heard. The sound of her own preferences, atrophied from disuse. The sound of her own boundaries, like property lines that had been forgotten but never actually erased. Those who had depended upon her endless giving begin to reveal their true relationship to her worth. Some grow angry, as if her withdrawal were theft rather than reclamation. Their anger reveals the unconscious contract they had made with her performing self, a contract that promised her value in exchange for her sacrifice. When the sacrifice ends, their investment in her value is revealed to be conditional, contingent upon her continued self-abandonment. Others grow confused, like children whose parent has suddenly changed the rules of a game they did not realize. They were playing. They reach for her energy with the automatic expectation of its availability, only to find empty space where her overflow once resided. Their confusion is not personal but archetypal, the bewilderment of the unconscious when confronted with consciousness, the disorientation of dependence when faced with sovereignty. But some few, the rarest and most precious, grow curious. They sense in her withdrawal not rejection, but invitation. They begin to question their own patterns of taking, their own relationship to reciprocity, their own capacity to generate the energy they had been unconsciously consuming from her. These relationships reveal themselves to be built upon something more substantial than convenience, something that can survive the earthquake of her authenticity. The withdrawal teaches her that energy, like water, seeks its own level. When she stops forcing it to flow upward against its natural inclination, it settles into patterns that serve life rather than depleting it. She discovers that she has been pouring herself out at a rate that was unsustainable, like a well that gives so much water it never has time to be replenished by the underground springs that are its source. In learning to say no, or more precisely, in learning to not automatically say yes, she rediscovers the profound power of choice. Each decision to not respond immediately, each choice to not solve others' problems automatically, each refusal to carry emotional weight that belongs to others becomes an act of radical self-respect. Not selfish, but self-aware, not cruel, but conscious. She begins to see that her excessive giving had been a form of control, though she had never recognized it as such. By anticipating needs, solving problems, smoothing difficulties, she had maintained the illusion that she could prevent others' discomfort, that she could love them out of their own inner work. Her withdrawal forces both herself and others to confront the truth that discomfort cannot be loved away, that growth requires facing difficulties directly, that authentic relationship demands the presence of two whole beings rather than one who gives and another who takes. The silence that follows her withdrawal is not empty, but pregnant with possibility. In this silence, she begins to hear the voice of her own intuition, so long drowned out by the demands of others' needs. She begins to feel the rhythm of her own natural cycles, no longer overridden by the urgency of others' immediate wants. She begins to sense the presence of her own soul, which had been waiting patiently for her attention like a faithful friend who knows that eventually the noisy party will end and there will be time for real conversation. This great withdrawal is not the end of her capacity for relationship, but the beginning of her capacity for authentic relationship. By learning to contain her own energy, to be selective about where and how it flows, she becomes capable of giving from fullness rather than emptiness, from choice rather than compulsion, from love rather than fear. The river that changes its course may leave dry beds where water once flowed, but it also discovers new territories, creates new landscapes, nourishes different ground. She is learning that her energy, properly channeled and consciously directed, can create more life than it ever could when scattered in all directions by unconscious need to prove her worth through endless availability. In the space created by her withdrawal, both she and others are forced to face what remains when the familiar patterns of interaction are disrupted. Some discover that without her constant energy, their connection to her was more habit than affection, more convenience than care. But others, and she herself most of all, discover that what remains when the performance ends is more real, more valuable, more capable of sustaining genuine intimacy than anything that existed before. The great withdrawal teaches her that love does not require the abandonment of self, that caring does not demand the sacrifice of boundaries, that being of service does not mean being in service. She learns that by taking care of her own energy, she becomes capable of offering others something far more valuable than her endless availability. Her authentic presence, consciously chosen and freely given. In the profound silence that follows her withdrawal, she encounters something that has been waiting in the wings of her consciousness, like an actor who knows their cue is coming. It is not the enemy she expected to find in her solitude, but neither is it the friend she hoped for. It is her shadow, that dark twin of her proving, that wounded aspect of her psyche that whispers with the voice of every rejection she has ever known. You were never enough as you were. This shadow figure emerges from the depths of her being, with the inevitability of spring after winter, carrying in its hands the accumulated evidence of a lifetime spent believing that love was something to be earned rather than something that belonged to her by virtue of her existence. It speaks in the voices of those who taught her, through word and action, that her value was contingent upon her performance, that her worth required constant proof, that her place in the world was not guaranteed, but must be purchased with endless giving. Jung understood that the shadow contains not only our rejected darkness, but also our wounded innocence, the parts of ourselves that were forced into hiding, not because they were evil, but because they were too tender to survive in a world that demanded hardness, too authentic to flourish in environments that required pretense. Her shadow of unworthiness carries within it the child who learned to perform love because receiving love felt too dangerous, too unreliable, too likely to disappear without warning. She sits with this shadow figure in the theater of her inner life, no longer as adversaries, but as two aspects of the same being seeking integration. The shadow does not speak in the voice of malevolence, but in the voice of protection gone wrong, the voice of a survival mechanism that has outlived its usefulness, but does not know how to stop defending against threats that no longer exist. Look at what happens when you stop proving, the shadow whispers, with the patience of something that has waited decades for this conversation. Look at how quickly they lose interest when you stop being useful. Look at how their love evaporates when you stop earning it. This is the evidence I have been collecting, the reason I have kept you performing, not from cruelty, but from the knowledge that your authentic self has never been enough to keep anyone. She feels the familiar ache of this belief, the way it sits in her chest like a stone worn smooth by years of being turned over and over in the hands of her consciousness. The belief that she is somehow fundamentally flawed, missing some essential quality that others possess naturally, cursed to always be trying to make up for an inadequacy so basic that it cannot be named but only compensated for through endless effort. But something has changed in her relationship to this wound. Where once she would have turned away from the shadow's voice, distracted herself with more proving, more giving, more desperate attempts to demonstrate her value, she now turns toward it with the curiosity of someone who has finally grown strong, enough to hear difficult truths without being destroyed by them. "Where did you learn this?" she asks the shadow, not with the voice of judgment, but with the voice of genuine inquiry. Where did you learn that love was something to be earned rather than something that flows naturally between beings who recognize each other's inherent worth? The shadow's response comes not in words but in images, memories that rise from the depths of her psyche like bubbles from the bottom of a deep pool. The parent whose love was conditional upon her behavior, whose attention she could earn through achievement but lose through any expression of need or imperfection. The friends who welcomed her when she was useful but grew distant when she required care. The partners who loved her giving nature but grew uncomfortable when she revealed her depth, her complexity, her human need for reciprocity. Each memory carries with it not just pain but information, the gradual education of a sensitive soul in the harsh arithmetic of conditional love. She sees now how each experience of conditional acceptance had built upon the last, creating a belief system so fundamental that she had never questioned it, only lived within its constraints like a bird that has known only cages and assumes that flying requires bars. "You've been trying to protect me," she says to the shadow, and feels the truth of this recognition settle into her bones. "You saw that my authentic self received rejection, criticism, abandonment, and you developed a strategy to keep me safe. You taught me to become what others needed so that I would never again face the devastation of being unwanted for who I truly am." The shadow's posture shifts, some of the defensive hardness melting away. It has waited so long to be understood. Rather than banished, to be seen as protector rather than persecutor. I have carried the burden of believing you were not enough so that you could keep trying to become enough. I have held the pain of every rejection so that you could keep hoping for acceptance. But I am tired now. The strategy that once saved you is now imprisoning you. This is the moment Jung wrote about when he spoke of the necessity of embracing the shadow rather than projecting it outward or suppressing it into unconsciousness. She feels the profound compassion that arises when one sees the wounded child within the monster, the protective impulse within the destructive pattern, the love within the fear that has been driving so much unconscious behavior. What would it feel like to believe that I am enough as I am? She asks, and feels the question reverberate through her entire being like a stone dropped into still water. The shadow considers this with the seriousness of someone contemplating revolution, for that is what this question represents, the complete overthrow of a government that has ruled her inner world for decades. I do not know, the shadow admits, and in this admission she hears not defeat but possibility. I have never had the luxury of believing in your inherent worth because I have been too busy trying to create evidence of it. But perhaps it is time to find out. She feels something shifting in the fundamental architecture of her psyche, like tectonic plates moving after eons of stability. The belief that she must earn love is beginning to crack, not under the force of positive thinking or spiritual bypassing, but under the weight of finally being seen clearly. Both her wound and her wholeness, both her fear and her inherent worth. The shadow of unworthiness begins to transform as she offers it not banishment, but integration. It becomes not the voice that drives her to prove herself, but the voice that reminds her to question any love that comes with conditions attached. Not the force that compels her to earn her place in the world, but the wisdom that helps her recognize when others are asking her to abandon herself in exchange for their approval. You can rest now, she tells the shadow, and means it. You do not have to keep proving that I am worthy of love. You do not have to keep collecting evidence of my value. You can lay down the burden of making me acceptable to those who cannot. See what is already present. The shadow looks at her with eyes that have grown soft with relief. But what if you are rejected? What if your authentic self is not enough for them? Then they were never my people, she replies, and feels the truth of this statement like sunlight breaking through clouds. If my authentic self is not enough for them, then their love was never real. It was conditional, transactional, based on my performance rather than my being, and I no longer wish to purchase love with the currency of self-abandonment. This integration of the shadow does not happen in a single moment, but begins as a new relationship, an ongoing conversation between the parts of herself that have been at war for so long. The shadow becomes not her enemy, but her ally in discerning authentic relationship from performance-based interaction. It becomes not the voice that demands her to prove herself, but the voice that reminds her that anyone who requires proof of her worth does not deserve access to her authentic self. She feels the energy that has been bound up in this internal conflict beginning to flow more freely through her system. The energy she has spent trying to convince herself that she was worthy, trying to convince others that she was worthy, trying to prove through endless giving that she deserved to take up space in the world, this energy becomes available for living rather than proving, for creating rather than compensating, for loving from fullness rather than desperation. The wounded child within her shadow begins to heal as she offers it what it has always needed, unconditional acceptance of its authentic self. Not acceptance that requires improvement or change or growth, but acceptance that sees worth as inherent rather than earned, value as given rather than achieved, love as birthright rather than reward for good behavior. In embracing her shadow of unworthiness, she does not become arrogant or disconnected from others' feedback. Instead, she becomes discerning about whose opinions carry weight in her life, conscious of the difference between constructive feedback and destructive criticism, aware of the distinction between those who see her worth and want to support her growth, and those who only see her utility and want to maintain her service. The shadow, no longer forced to operate from the unconscious, becomes a source of wisdom rather than compulsion. It helps her recognize the subtle ways that others might try to reinstate the old dynamic, the unconscious pressure to return to proving rather than being. It becomes her ally in maintaining the boundaries that protect her authentic self from those who would prefer her performing self. As this integration deepens, she begins to understand that her worth was never actually in question, only her ability to recognize and honor it. The shadow of unworthiness had been carrying not truth but trauma, not reality, but the distorted reflections of those who could not see her clearly because they had never learned to see themselves clearly. The theater of her inner life transforms as these two aspects of herself learn to work together rather than against each other. Where once there had been the constant tension between authentic expression and fearful performance, there now grows a unified voice that speaks from wholeness rather than woundedness, from sovereignty rather than seeking, from the knowledge that love which must be earned was never love at all. In meeting and embracing her shadow of unworthiness, she reclaims not only her inherent value, but her right to expect others to recognize and honor it. She no longer settles for relationships where her worth is conditional, where her value must be constantly demonstrated, where her place must be continuously earned. She begins to surround herself only with those who see her inherent worth as clearly as she's learning to see it herself. As the days stretch into weeks without her familiar presence filling every silence, those who had grown accustomed to her endless availability begin to experience something profound and disturbing. The alchemical transformation that only loss can catalyze, where her laughter once echoed through their difficult moments, where her solutions once appeared like magic to resolve their complications, where her emotional labor once smoothed every rough edge of their existence. These spaces become mirrors, reflecting back their own emptiness with a clarity that is both illuminating and uncomfortable. The alchemy of absence works with the patient inevitability of all natural processes. Just as the removal of light reveals what was always present in darkness, the withdrawal of her energy reveals what was always present in their dependence. The transformation begins slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the way a photograph develops. In the darkroom, gradually revealing images that were always there, waiting in the chemical soup of unconsciousness to be brought into the light of awareness. In Jung's understanding, transformation often requires what he called the mortificatio, a symbolic death that precedes rebirth. Her absence creates this death in their psyche, the death of the fantasy that someone else's energy could substitute for their own inner work, that someone else's emotional labor could spare them the necessity of developing their own emotional intelligence, that someone else's constant availability could fill the void within them that only their own self-relationship could address. Those who had positioned themselves as the primary recipients of her overflow begin to feel the discomfort of their own unmet needs, like phantom pain from an amputated limb. The problems that she had always helped them solve now sit unsolved, demanding that they develop capacities they had allowed to atrophy through disuse. The emotional regulation she had provided through her constant reassurance and support now becomes their own responsibility, a weight they had forgotten they carried before she had lifted it from them. The friend who had called her at all hours, certain of her availability, now stares at a phone that rings unanswered. In the silence that follows each unanswered call, he begins to hear something he had been avoiding, the sound of his own anxiety without her voice to soothe it. The discomfort forces him to face the question he had been unconsciously avoiding. What did his life look like when it was not being managed by her emotional labor? The family member who had grown accustomed to her endless solutions now sits with problems that require his own creativity, his own resilience, his own inner resources. The panic that arises when he realizes she will not swoop in to fix what he has left broken becomes a teacher, showing him the profound extent to which he had outsourced his own competence to her willingness to carry what belonged to him. But the alchemy of absence works differently on different souls. Some respond to the transformation with anger, as if her withdrawal were theft rather than boundary setting. These are the ones whose connection to her was purely extractive, who had never learned to see her as a full human being with her own needs, her own limits, her own right to self-preservation. Their anger reveals the unconscious contract they had made with her performing self, a contract that assumed her energy belonged to them, that her availability was their entitlement, that her care was their right rather than her gift. Others respond with confusion that slowly ripens into curiosity. These are the ones whose connection to her contained some seed of genuine care, however underdeveloped. They begin to ask questions they had never thought to ask before. What did she need? What was she feeling? What had her experience been while she was so busy attending to theirs? The confusion becomes a doorway to consciousness, an invitation to relationship rather than consumption. The transformation is particularly profound in those who had used her as their primary emotional processor. Without her constant availability to help them make sense of their feelings, to provide perspective on their problems, to offer reassurance about their choices, they are forced to develop their own relationship with their inner life. Some discover that they have been living like emotional infants, dependent on her for functions that they were capable of performing themselves, but had never been required to develop. The space where her emotional labor once resided becomes a laboratory for their own growth. The comfort she had provided, genuine though it was, had also been a form of enabling, preventing them from developing the emotional muscles that only grow through use. Her absence forces these muscles into service, revealing strength they did not know they possessed and capabilities they had never been required to access. But the alchemy works most powerfully on their capacity for empathy. In experiencing their own discomfort at her absence, they begin to understand, perhaps for the first time, the magnitude of what she had been providing. The energy that had flowed from her so constantly, so naturally, that it seemed effortless. They now feel its absence as a tangible loss, a deficit that makes visible the gift they had been unconsciously receiving. Some begin to trace backward through their memories, seeing with new eyes the countless moments when she had carried their emotional weight, solved their problems, provided solutions they had accepted as their due. The recognition arrives not as guilt, but as education, teaching them the difference between receiving someone's gifts with consciousness and consuming someone's energy with entitlement. The friend who always called in crisis begins to notice how rarely he had asked about her crises. The family member who relied on her solutions begins to remember the last time he had offered to help with her problems. The pattern becomes visible like handwriting that had been written in invisible ink, now revealed by the heat of her absence. This recognition initiates what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to bridge opposite states of being. Some begin to develop their own capacity to give rather than only receive, to support rather than only be supported, to listen rather than only be heard. They discover that in developing these capacities, they do not lose something, but gain something. Not just the ability to be of service to others, but the deeper satisfaction that comes from living as a full human being, rather than an eternal dependent. The transformation reveals the profound unconsciousness that had characterized their approach to relationship. They see now how they had been living like emotional consumers, taking from her abundance without questioning whether their taking was balanced by giving, whether their needs were being met at the expense of hers, whether their comfort was purchased. With her self-abandonment. But the deepest alchemy occurs in their understanding of love itself. Those who are capable of growth begin to recognize that what they had called love was often need disguised as affection, dependency masquerading as connection. True love, they begin to understand, requires seeing the other as a full being with their own inner life, their own needs, their own limits, their own right to self-care. The absence teaches them that sustainable relationship requires reciprocity, not the mechanical exchange of equivalent goods, but the organic flow of energy between two beings who are both capable of giving and receiving, both willing to carry their own emotional weight while occasionally supporting each other's burdens. Some discover, to their surprise, that they are capable of much more than they had believed. Without her constant support, they develop their own problem-solving abilities, their own emotional resilience, their own capacity to sit with discomfort without immediately seeking someone else to make it better. The strength that had been dormant under her care begins to emerge, like plants that have been growing in shade suddenly exposed to direct sunlight. Others discover that their connection to her had been entirely parasitic, that without her energy to consume, they have no interest in relationship with her at all. These relationships reveal themselves to have been transactions rather than connections, arrangements rather than affections. The alchemy of absence burns away these false relationships like fire burns away dross, leaving only what is genuine. For those capable of receiving its teaching, her absence becomes a gift more valuable than her presence had ever been. It forces them to develop their own inner resources, to take responsibility for their own emotional life, to approach relationship as equals rather than as dependents. It teaches them to value what is freely given rather than taking what is compulsively offered. The spaces she once filled with her energy become sacred voids, not emptiness to be immediately filled, but conscious spaces where they can encounter their own capacity for fullness. In learning to sit with these spaces without immediately seeking to fill them with someone else's energy, they begin the slow work of developing their own relationship with solitude, their own capacity to be present to their inner life without constant external validation and support. The alchemy of her absence transforms not only their relationship to her, but their understanding of what relationship can be when it is built upon consciousness rather than unconsciousness, reciprocity rather than extraction, appreciation rather than entitlement. Those who receive this transformation become capable, for the first time, of loving her authentically rather than needing her desperately. There is a word that lives in the throat like a stone, heavy with the weight of lifetimes spent swallowing it whole. No, two letters that contain within them the entire architecture of selfhood, the sacred geometry of boundaries that separate the self from the endless, devouring hunger of the world. For so long, this word has been a stranger to her lips, banished to the shadowlands of her psyche, where forbidden things grow wild and untended. She has been the eternal yes-sayer, the perpetual door left ajar, the well that never runs dry, no matter how many come to drink from her depths. In Jung's understanding, she has worn the persona of the eternal giver so thoroughly that it has become fused with her very identity, a mask so perfectly fitted that she has forgotten the face beneath. But masks, no matter how beautiful, how socially rewarded, eventually become prisons of the soul. The recognition comes like lightning splitting the darkness of a storm-laden sky. She has been dying by degrees, not through any dramatic catastrophe, but through the slow hemorrhaging of her life force into the bottomless needs of others. Each yes when she meant no has been a small death, a betrayal of the sacred self that dwells in the hidden chambers of her heart. The rescuer, the helper, the one who fixes and tends and mends, these roles have become a golden cage, beautiful from the outside but suffocating within. In the beginning, saying no feels like murder. The word rises from her belly like bile, burning her throat with its unfamiliarity. When she first dares to speak it, no, I cannot take on another project. No, I will not solve this crisis for you. No, my evening is my own. She feels as though she is wielding a blade against the very fabric of relationship itself. The old conditioning screams its protests, selfish, cruel, heartless. But beneath these familiar accusations, something else stirs, a recognition, ancient and true. The no that emerges is not the petulant refusal of a child denied its desires, nor the bitter rejection of one who has closed their heart to the world. This is the no of the queen who understands her own sovereignty, the priestess who guards the temple of her own soul. It is the no that creates space for the yes that matters, the boundary that allows authentic love to flow, rather than being drained away by obligation and guilt. Each time she speaks this sacred word, she feels something shift in the landscape of her being. The phantom limbs of old patterns, the reaching, the giving, the endless availability, begin to retract. In their place, something else begins to grow. The exquisite sensation of occupying her own space fully, completely, without apology or explanation. She discovers that refusal is not the opposite of love, but its guardian. When she says no to the request that would drain her, she is saying yes to the energy that allows her to show up fully for what truly matters. When she declines to fix another's self-created crisis, she is offering them the gift of their own competence, their own capacity to grow through struggle. The codependent dance that has ruled her relationships begins to falter as she steps out of the familiar choreography of rescue and collapse. The word becomes easier with practice, like a muscle that grows stronger with use. No, I won't be attending that gathering that leaves me feeling empty. No, I won't explain my decisions to those who feel entitled to judge them. No, I won't carry the emotional burdens that belong to others. Each refusal is a small resurrection, a reclaiming of the territory of the self that had been ceded to the empire of other people's expectations. But this transformation is not without its shadows. The people in her life who have grown accustomed to her endless availability begin to push back against these new boundaries, like waves against a newly built seawall. They employ the old strategies, guilt, manipulation, the suggestion that her newfound boundaries are evidence of her fundamental selfishness. Some relationships she discovers with both sorrow and relief were built entirely on the foundation of her self-sacrifice. When that foundation shifts, the structures collapse, revealing that what she thought was love was often merely convenience. What she believed was appreciation was actually exploitation. The death of the eternal yes-sayer is grieved not only by others, but by the part of herself that found identity in being indispensable. There is a terrible loneliness in those first days of boundary setting, a sense of standing alone in a landscape suddenly unfamiliar. The persona that brought her praise and validation lies in ruins, and she must learn to find worth not in her usefulness, but in her simple existence as a sovereign being. Yet from this apparent devastation, something magnificent begins to emerge. The energy that once scattered itself across the needs and demands of others begins to coalesce, to gather itself like morning mist condensing into dew. She discovers reserves of creativity, passion, and joy that had been buried beneath years of compulsive giving. The silence that follows her newfound ability to say no is not empty, but pregnant with possibility. In the archetypal realm that Jung mapped so carefully, she is undergoing the transformation from the caregiver to the queen, from the one who serves to the one who chooses whom to serve and why. This is not a journey from compassion to coldness, but from unconscious giving to conscious loving. The no that once felt like violence reveals itself as the fierce protection of something precious, her own authentic nature, her own sacred fire. The people who remain in her life after this boundary revolution are those who see her worth beyond her utility, who value her presence over her productivity. These relationships, tested by her newfound ability to refuse, prove themselves genuine by adapting to her new sovereignty rather than attempting to manipulate her back into the old patterns of self-abandonment. She begins to understand that the word no is not the enemy of relationship, but its purifier. It burns away the false connections built on exploitation and reveals the true bonds forged in mutual respect and authentic care. When she says no to what drains her, she creates space for the relationships that nourish her soul rather than emptying. The transformation extends beyond the interpersonal realm into every corner of her existence. She says no to the job that requires her to betray her values. No to the social obligations that leave her feeling hollow. No to the inner critic that demands she justify her right to exist as she is. Each refusal is an act of self-creation, a deliberate choice to craft a life that reflects her deepest truths rather than the expectations of a world that would consume her if she allowed it. This is the paradox of the sacred no. In learning to refuse, she discovers what it means to truly choose. In setting boundaries, she finds freedom. In disappointing others' demands for her constant availability, she keeps faith with the most important appointment of all, the one with her own soul. The word that once felt like cruelty reveals itself as the deepest compassion, the fierce protection of the light that burns within her, the recognition that her life force is not a commodity to be spent, but a sacred flame to be tended. The no that rises from her lips now carries the authority of one who has reclaimed her throne, who has remembered that she is not a servant to the world's endless hunger, but a sovereign being with the right to choose how her energy is spent. In this choosing, she finds not isolation, but connection, the authentic bonds that form when two whole beings meet each other across the space that healthy boundaries create. She learns that the most radical act of love is often the refusal to enable, the no that forces growth, the boundary that creates space for others to discover their own strength. The rescuer within her may have died, but in her place stands something far more powerful, a woman who loves from fullness rather than emptiness, who gives from choice rather than compulsion, who has learned that the word no is not the opposite of generosity, but its most sophisticated expression. In the end, she understands that reclaiming the sacred no is not about becoming hard or closed, but about becoming real. It is the return to the authentic self that lies beneath the layers of conditioning and expectation, the recovery of the voice that knows its own worth without needing external validation. The word that once felt impossible now flows from her. Lips like a prayer, a declaration of sovereignty, a blessed boundary between the self that gives and the self that must be preserved in order to give authentically. This is her resurrection, not the return of what was, but the birth of what has always been waiting to emerge. In learning to say no to what diminishes her, she discovers her yes to what enlarges her soul. The sacred refusal becomes the gateway to the sacred life, the boundary that allows love to flow rather than hemorrhage, the word that saves not only herself, but all those who will benefit from her presence when she is truly, fully, authentically alive. In the deepest chambers of the psyche, where the most fundamental transformations unfold like flowers blooming in darkness, a death is taking place. Not the cessation of breath or the stopping of a heart, but something far more profound, the dissolution of an identity so deeply rooted, so thoroughly integrated into the architecture of the self, that its passing feels like the end of everything. She has ever known herself to be, the rescuer must die. This archetypal figure who has lived within her for so long, who has shaped her responses to the world with the relentless certainty of gravity. This savior self who believed that love could only be earned through the endless expenditure of her own life force, must undergo the ultimate transformation. She must be allowed to die so that something truer, something more authentic to the soul's deepest calling can be born from the rich soil of that symbolic grave. Jung understood that the most profound transformations require a genuine death, not merely change or adjustment, but the complete dissolution of what was, so that what must be can emerge. This is the alchemical process of solve et coagula. Dissolve and coagulate, break down and rebuild, die and be reborn. The chrysalis does not simply renovate the caterpillar, it completely dissolves it into primordial soup before reconstituting. It has something entirely other, entirely new. For her, the rescuer self has been more than a role. It has been the very foundation of her identity, the lens through which she has interpreted every relationship, every interaction, every moment of her existence. She has been the one who steps into the breach when others stumble, who carries the emotional weather of entire families and friend groups, who transforms herself into whatever shape is needed to fill the gaps in others' broken lives. Her worth has been measured not by her being but by her doing, not by her presence but by her utility. The death begins with recognition, a moment of terrible clarity when she sees the pattern for what it truly is. She sees how her compulsive rescuing has not actually saved anyone, but has instead created a network of dependence that serves no one's highest good. The people she has rescued remain unrescued because true rescue cannot come from outside the self. Her interventions have become barriers to their growth. Her solutions have become obstacles to their self-discovery. Her care has become a subtle form of control. This recognition arrives like a lightning strike, illuminating in one terrible instant the vast landscape of her unconscious motivations. She sees how the rescuer self has been a way of avoiding her own depths, her own unhealed wounds, her own need for rescue. By staying perpetually focused on others' crises, she has been able to avoid the terrifying journey into her own inner wilderness. The rescuer has been both her greatest achievement and her most sophisticated form of spiritual bypassing. The dying begins slowly, like the gradual fading of a photograph left too long in sunlight. The old reflexes still fire, the automatic "I can fix this" response to others' pain, the immediate assessment of how she might solve problems that were never hers to solve. But now, these impulses are met with a new awareness, a conscious recognition of the pattern even as it attempts to assert itself. She begins to catch herself in the act of rescue, to pause in that space between stimulus and response that Viktor Frankl identified as the location of human freedom. Each time she chooses not to rescue, something within her dies a little more. The part of her that found purpose in being needed, that felt alive only when swimming in the choppy waters of others' chaos, begins to wither from lack of nourishment. This is not a comfortable death. It is accompanied by anxiety, by the fear that if she is not the rescuer, she might be nothing at all. The ego that has organized itself around this role fights desperately to maintain its supremacy, creating elaborate justifications for why this situation or that person truly needs her intervention. But the deeper wisdom of the psyche, what Jung called the self with a capital S, knows that this death is necessary. The self orchestrates the circumstances that make the old way of being untenable. that force the confrontation with the rescuer self's ultimate futility. Relationships begin to shift in ways that make her rescuing either impossible or obviously counterproductive. The people she has been saving begin to resist her help or to reveal how her assistance has actually hindered their development. The universe itself seems to conspire to show her that the role she has cherished is no longer serving anyone, least of all herself. The most difficult aspect of this death is the grieving that accompanies it. She must mourn not only the loss of an identity, but the loss of all the secondary gains that came with being the rescuer, the sense of importance, of being indispensable, of having a clear role in the world. All of this must be released. She must face the possibility that she might be ordinary, that her worth might not be earned through heroic acts of salvation, but might simply exist as a fundamental quality of her being. The people in her life who have benefited from her rescuing begin to sense the shift long before she announces it explicitly. There is something different in the quality of her presence, a new stillness where once there was perpetual motion toward others' needs. They may initially interpret this change as depression or illness, unable to conceive that what they are witnessing is not pathology, but transformation. Some will attempt to draw her back into the old role through increasingly dramatic displays of crisis, testing whether the rescuer can truly be dead or if she is merely sleeping. As the rescuer self continues its dying process, she enters what mystics have long recognized as the dark night of the soul, a period of profound disorientation when the old ways of being have been abandoned, but the new ways have not yet solidified. She may feel empty, purposeless, adrift in a world that suddenly seems foreign and unwelcoming. The activities that once gave her life meaning, the constant tending to others' needs, the elaborate orchestrations of healing and helping, now feel hollow and mechanical. This emptiness, though terrifying, is actually pregnant with possibility. It is the void from which creation emerges, the silence from which new songs are born. Jung understood that the most profound transformations require a journey through what he called the nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction, the descent, into the depths where all false structures dissolve so that authentic being can emerge. In the depths of this dissolution, she begins to encounter aspects of herself that have been buried beneath layers of compulsive caregiving. She discovers anger, not the petty irritation of daily life, but the deep, legitimate rage of one who has betrayed herself repeatedly in service to others' expectations. She finds grief for the self she never allowed to exist, the dreams she never pursued, the paths she never walked, because she was too busy clearing the paths for others. Most surprisingly, she discovers fear, the terror of being unloved, unwanted, unnecessary, that has driven the rescuer self from the very beginning. This fear, when finally faced directly, reveals itself to be not a monster, but a wounded child who has been convinced that love must be earned through endless giving. The rescuer has been this child's attempt to guarantee love, to make herself so useful that abandonment becomes impossible. But as the rescuer dies, something else begins to stir in the depths of her being. It is tentative at first, like the first green shoots pushing through winter soil, but it carries within it the promise of an entirely different way of engaging with the world. This nascent self is not driven by the compulsion to save, but by the desire to truly love. To love from fullness rather than emptiness, to love without agenda, to love in a way that honors both her own sovereignty and that of others. This emerging self understands that true love sometimes means allowing others to struggle, to fail, to find their own way through the labyrinth of their lives. It recognizes that rescue, when offered prematurely or repeatedly, can become a form of spiritual theft. stealing from others the opportunity to discover their own strength, their own wisdom, their own capacity for transformation. The death of the rescuer is not a single event, but a process that unfolds over months or even years. There are moments when the old self seems to resurrect, when crisis calls and the familiar patterns reassert themselves. But each time this happens, she is able to recognize it more quickly, to step back from the automatic response and choose differently. The rescuer's dying gasps become opportunities for deeper integration, for further release, for more complete surrender to the transformative process. As this archetypal death deepens, she begins to understand that what she has been calling love was often something else entirely. Control, disguised as care, anxiety masquerading as compassion, her own unmet needs projected onto others' situations. True love, she discovers, is far more mysterious and far more demanding than the rescuer ever imagined. It requires the courage to let others be who they are, rather than who she thinks they should be. It demands the wisdom to know when to act, and when to refrain from action, when to offer support, and when to step back and allow natural consequences to unfold. The relationships in her life that have been built primarily on the foundation of her rescuing begin to shift dramatically during this process. Some connections, she discovers, cannot survive the death of the rescuer because they were never based on genuine mutual care, but on a kind of symbiotic dysfunction where her compulsive helping enabled others' compulsive helplessness. These relationships may end with confusion, anger, or mutual bewilderment, but their ending creates space for more authentic connections to form. Other relationships prove more resilient, adapting to her transformation with the flexibility that characterizes true love. These connections deepen as they are freed from the distortion of the rescuer dynamic, allowing both parties to meet each other as whole beings rather than as complementary fragments. She discovers that she can love more deeply, more purely, when she is not driven by the desperate need to be needed. The empty space left by the rescuer's death gradually fills with something far more precious, authentic presence. Instead of the frantic doing that characterized her old way of being, she learns the art of simply being with others in their joy and their sorrow without feeling compelled to change their experience. This presence, she discovers, is often more healing than all her previous attempts at rescue ever were. As the transformation continues, she begins to understand that the rescuer had to die, not because rescuing is inherently wrong, but because unconscious rescuing is a form of spiritual violence, violent toward herself because it denies her own needs and authentic nature, and violent toward others because it assumes they are incapable of handling their own lives. Conscious helping, when it emerges from fullness rather than compulsion, becomes something entirely different, a gift offered freely rather than a transaction demanded by inner emptiness. The death of the rescuer is ultimately a death in service to life, the death of false compassion so that true compassion can be born, the death of compulsive helping so that authentic service can emerge, the death of codependent love so that sovereign love can flourish. From the rich compost of this psychological death, new life springs forth, not the life of the one who saves, but the life of the one who loves. Not the existence of the indispensable helper, but the being of the authentically present woman. In the end, she comes to understand that the rescuer's death was not a loss but a liberation, the freeing of her authentic self from the golden cage of others' expectations and her own unconscious needs. What emerges from this symbolic grave is not a diminished version of who she was, but a fuller, truer, more complete expression of who she has always been beneath the layers of compulsive caregiving. The death that seemed like ending reveals itself. As beginning, the dissolution that felt like destruction proves to be the most creative act of her life. This is the mystery of psychological transformation, that sometimes we must die to who we think we are in order to be born into who we truly are. The rescuer's death is not the end of caring, but its purification, not the abandonment of love, but its maturation, not the cessation of service, but its transformation from compulsion to choice. In allowing this archetypal figure to die completely, she creates space for something far more beautiful to be born. The woman who loves not from need, but from abundance, who serves not from compulsion, but from joy, who has learned that the greatest rescue she can offer, the world, is the fullness of her own authentic being. In the spaces she has vacated, something stirs. Not presence, but absence. Not substance, but shadow. The ghost of what was given so freely, so consistently, so unconsciously, that its sudden withdrawal creates a palpable void. Those who remain behind begin to feel her absence, not as mere emptiness, but as a haunting, a spectral reminder of all they possessed, but never truly saw, never valued, never honored, until it vanished like morning mist touched by the harsh light of recognition. The haunting begins in the small spaces first, the kitchen where meals materialized without fanfare, prepared by hands that never asked for thanks because thanks were never offered. The empty stovetop now seems to accuse with its cold silence. The unused cutting board, the spices that gather dust, the recipes that remain forever uncooked, each object becomes a monument to what was taken for granted. The refrigerator, once magically replenished, now stands as a testament to the invisible. Labor that sustained not just bodies, but the very illusion that care simply happens. That nourishment appears without effort or intention. They wander through rooms that feel subtly different now, though nothing has been moved, nothing has been changed, except the absence of her energy moving through these spaces like a benevolent current. The living room where problems were solved in whispered conversations, where tears were dried and fears were soothed, now echoes with a hollow quality that cannot be filled by furniture or warmth or even other voices. The very air seems thinner, less nurturing, as if her presence had been a kind of atmospheric condition that made breathing easier for everyone else. Jung spoke of the psychological reality of absence, how what is missing can be more powerfully present than what remains. In the wake of her withdrawal, her ghost presence haunts not through visible manifestation, but through the sudden awareness of everything she was doing, everything she was being, everything she was providing that allowed others to live there. Lives without attending to the fundamental questions of care, responsibility, and emotional regulation. The dinners that no longer appear at the expected hour become specters of abundance taken for granted. The meals were never just about food. They were about the energy of anticipation, the labor of planning, the love translated into nutrition, the care made manifest in the simple act of feeding others. Now, facing empty plates and the bewildering complexity of nourishing themselves, they begin to understand that she was not simply cooking, but conjuring, transforming raw ingredients into the alchemy of care, creating not just sustenance, but the feeling of being sustained, supported, held by forces larger than themselves. The problems that once found resolution through her intervention now loom larger in the landscape of their lives, growing in the absence of her steady presence. These were not small problems. They were the fundamental challenges of human existence that she had been quietly absorbing, processing, and resolving so that others could maintain the illusion that life was manageable, that chaos could be contained, that someone somewhere was handling the unbearable complexity of being human. Her withdrawal reveals the truth that had been hidden by her competence. These problems were never solved, only temporarily managed by her endless capacity to absorb difficulty and transform it into apparent ease. The emotional storms that no longer find her steady presence to anchor them rage with newfound intensity. She had been the eye of every hurricane, the still point around which family dramas and friend crises could swirl without destroying everything in their path. Her emotional regulation had become the invisible foundation upon which others built their emotional lives, never recognizing that their stability was entirely dependent on her sacrifice of her own emotional landscape to their needs. Now, without her presence to contain and transform the raw energy of others' feelings, emotions, ricochet through relationships with a violence that feels both foreign and familiar. Arguments that she would have prevented escalate into lasting damage. Hurts that she would have healed fester into resentment. The emotional intelligence that she provided, the ability to read between lines, to anticipate needs, to smooth rough edges before they cut too deeply, is suddenly absent, leaving others to navigate the sharp terrain of human feeling without their accustomed guide. The haunting deepens as they begin to encounter the true cost of their dependence on her invisible labor, the thank you notes that now go unwritten, the appointments that remain unmade, the social obligations that fall through the cracks. Each oversight becomes a reminder of the vast network of care and attention that she had been maintaining behind the scenes. They had lived their lives as if these things happened through some natural law, as inevitable and unconscious as gravity or the rising of the sun. But perhaps the most profound haunting occurs in the realm of emotional weather, that subtle atmospheric condition that she had been creating and maintaining through her presence, her attention, her capacity to absorb negativity and radiate calm. Without her there to moderate the emotional climate, they find themselves exposed to the raw elements of their own unprocessed feelings and unexamined patterns. The space feels colder, harsher, less forgiving, not because anything external has changed, but because the warmth they had taken for granted was never environmental but personal, never automatic, but consciously generated by her perpetual emotional labor. The ghost of her care haunts them most powerfully in moments of crisis, when the automatic reflex to turn toward her meets only emptiness. The phone number that no longer answers their calls, the presence that no longer materializes in times of need, the wisdom that no longer flows forth to resolve their dilemmas. Each absent response becomes a confrontation with their own helplessness, their own underdeveloped capacity to handle the fundamental challenges of existence. They begin to realize that she had not simply been helping them, but had been living their emotional lives for them, processing their difficulties through her own psyche, metabolizing their stress through her own system. Her withdrawal forces them to develop emotional muscles that have atrophied through disuse, to cultivate capacities that had remained dormant because her competence made their development unnecessary. In the silence, where her voice once offered solutions, they must learn to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, the anxiety of unresolved problems, the terror of their own inadequacy. The questions that she would have answered with patient wisdom now echo unanswered in the chambers of their minds, forcing them to develop their own relationship with uncertainty, their own capacity to tolerate the ambiguity of existence without someone else providing the certainty they crave. The haunting extends beyond practical matters into the realm of identity itself. Many of those left behind discover that their sense of self had been subtly but profoundly dependent on her presence, her reflection, her interpretation of their experiences. She had been not just a helper, but a kind of external emotional processor, taking in the raw data of their lives and returning it to them, organized, clarified, made bearable. Without this service, they must learn to know themselves directly, to interpret their own experiences, to find meaning in their lives without Her constant translation and validation. Some respond to this haunting with anger, projecting onto her the rage they feel at their own helplessness. They may attempt to villainize her withdrawal, to frame her absence as cruelty or abandonment, rather than the natural consequence of years of unconscious exploitation. This anger serves as a defense against the more difficult recognition that they had been living at her expense, drawing their sense of stability and well-being from her inexhaustible willingness to sacrifice her own. Others fall into a kind of bewildered depression, suddenly aware of how much of their life had been managed by someone else, how little they had developed their own capacity for the fundamental tasks of emotional and practical self-care. The recognition that they had been living in a kind of extended childhood, protected from the full weight of adult responsibility by her willingness to carry what they could not or would not carry themselves, becomes a source of profound shame and disorientation. But for some, the haunting becomes the beginning of a different kind of awakening. In the empty spaces left by her withdrawal, they begin to discover capacities they never knew they possessed, the problems that seemed insurmountable, without her intervention, slowly yield to their own developing competence. The emotional storms that once required her presence to weather gradually become manageable through their own growing emotional intelligence. These fortunate few begin to understand that her gift to them was not her perpetual availability, but her eventual absence, the forced development of their own strength that could only come through the withdrawal of her support. They realize that her constant rescuing had been preventing them from discovering their own resilience, their own wisdom, their own capacity to create lives of meaning and stability without depending on someone else's sacrifice. The empty chair at the dinner table becomes not just a reminder of her absence, but a symbol of the space they must learn to fill, not with another person's care, but with their own attention to the art of nourishment. The practice of creating home, the daily discipline of turning a house into a haven through conscious intention rather than unconscious expectation. The problems that pile up without her intervention become opportunities for developing their own problem-solving muscles, their own capacity to face difficulty without immediately seeking rescue. The emotional storms that once required her steadying presence become chances to develop their own inner anchor, their own capacity to remain centered in the midst of chaos. The haunting begins to transform from accusation to invitation, from the ghost of dependency to the call toward independence. The empty spaces left by her withdrawal become not voids to be filled by finding another source of the same care, but openings to be occupied by their own developing maturity, their own growing capacity to tend their lives with the same attention and devotion she had brought to tending theirs. In the end, the most profound haunting is not the absence of her care, but the presence of the possibility that they too could learn to care, for themselves, for each other, for the spaces they inhabit. With the same devotion she had brought to caring for them, her ghost whispers not of what they have lost, but of what they might yet discover within themselves, not of their inadequacy, but of their unrealized potential. The empty spaces she has left behind become mirrors reflecting not just what she was to them, but what they could become to themselves and to each other. The haunting transforms from a lament for what was taken for granted into a recognition of what might be cultivated, from grief for the care that is gone into gratitude for the care that could yet be born within their own hearts and hands and daily practices. This is the deepest mystery of her absence, that in withdrawing her care, she offers them the possibility of discovering their own. In leaving the spaces empty, she creates room for them to learn to fill those spaces themselves, not with the same unconscious provision she offered, but with the conscious choice to create lives worthy of the love she showed them, worthy of The care she gave, worthy of the devotion she embodied, until they could learn to embody it themselves. The haunting in the end is not punishment, but gift. The gift of recognizing what was always there. The gift of being forced to develop what was always possible. The gift of learning that the love she gave them was not hers alone, but a quality of existence itself, available to anyone willing to cultivate it, to practice it, to offer it first to themselves, and then, from that fullness, to the world that so desperately needs it. There comes a moment in the soul's journey when the great performance finally ends, not with applause or recognition, but with the quiet exhale of someone who has grown weary of the stage. She steps back from the footlights of others' expectations, removes the costume of perpetual giving, and discovers something remarkable in the wings of her own solitude. The person she was before she learned to be what others needed. This is not abandonment of love, but its deepest expression. For how can one truly love another when one has never learned to love oneself? How can authentic connection bloom from the soil of self-betrayal? The paradox reveals itself like dawn breaking over familiar landscape made strange by new light. In ceasing to perform love, she discovers what love actually is. The magnetic pull she once generated was the desperate gravity of a collapsed star, drawing everything into its hungry center only to consume it in the fires of its own need. People came to her not for who she was, but for what she could provide. The endless well of attention, the mirror that reflected only their best qualities, the sanctuary that asked nothing in return. This was not magnetism, but vampirism dressed in the clothes of virtue, and she, the willing donor, bleeding herself white in service to their appetites. But now, in the fertile darkness of her withdrawal, something else begins to emerge. Like a seed that must first rot in the earth before it can sprout, her old self dissolves to make room for what wants to be born. The frantic energy of the people-pleaser transforms into something quieter, deeper, more substantial. Where once there was the brittle brightness of someone always on, now there is the steady warmth of someone simply present to herself. This new presence is like the difference between artificial light and sunlight. Both illuminate, but one is harsh and demanding while the other simply is, casting shadows that define rather than hide, creating warmth that nourishes rather than burns. She no longer enters a room scanning for who needs her, what role she should play, how she can make herself useful. Instead, she arrives as herself, not the self that has been carved and polished by others' expectations, but the self that exists in the secret chambers of her own heart. The transformation is subtle, but profound. In conversation, she no longer rushes to fill every silence, to anticipate every need, to sacrifice her own thoughts on the altar of others' comfort. She allows space for her own opinions, her own needs, her own mysterious depths to show themselves. And in doing so, she discovers something the performance self never knew, that people are not only capable of handling her authenticity, but hungry for it. There is a quality to authentic presence that cannot be manufactured or taught. It is like the difference between a photograph and a living landscape. Both may be beautiful, but only one breathes. When someone stops performing and starts being, they emit a kind of signal that reaches some deep, primal part of the human psyche. It is the recognition of truth, of substance, of someone who has touched the bedrock of their own being and found it solid. This magnetism operates on entirely different principles than the old, desperate pull. It does not seek to capture or possess, but to witness and be witnessed. It does not promise to solve or fix, but to accompany and understand. It does not offer itself as sacrifice, but as equal participant in the sacred dance of human connection. People begin to notice the change, though they may not understand what they're noticing. The ones who were drawn only to her usefulness find themselves strangely unsettled. like children who have arrived at a candy store only to find it transformed into a library. They sense something has shifted, but cannot name what they have lost. Only that the easy feast of her attention is no longer spread before them without reciprocity. But others, those who possess their own authenticity or hunger for it in themselves, are drawn by an entirely different force. They recognize in her presence permission to be themselves, not the polished, performing versions of themselves, but the raw, real, imperfect beings who struggle and doubt and hope and dream behind the masks they wear. Her authenticity creates space for theirs, like one tuning fork causing another to vibrate in sympathetic resonance. The conversations change. Where once they centered on others' needs, problems, and endless processing of their emotional states, now they become exchanges, true meetings of minds and hearts. She speaks of her own experiences, her own insights, her own questions about the mystery of being human. And in doing so, she gives others the gift of knowing her not as a function, but as a person. This is the great paradox of authentic magnetism. It draws people not by promising to be everything they need, but by demonstrating the courage to be exactly what it is, like a lighthouse that does not chase ships, but simply shines its light steadily from its fixed position. Authentic presence allows others to navigate toward it by choice rather than compulsion. The quality of her relationships begins to transform. The transactional exchanges, her attention for their validation, her service for their affection, give way to something more mutual and sustaining. She discovers that when she stops being available for everything, she becomes available for what matters. When she stops saying yes to every request, her yes carries the weight of genuine choice rather than compulsive compliance. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being loved only for what you provide rather than who you are. It is the loneliness of the successful performer who knows that the applause is for the role, not the person beneath it. She had lived in this loneliness so long, she had mistaken it for love itself, believing that being needed was the same as being valued, that being useful was the same as being cherished. But authentic presence dissolves this illusion like morning mist before the sun. When someone truly sees her, not what she can do for them, but who she is beneath all her doing, she experiences a kind of recognition that is both foreign and deeply familiar. It is like coming home to a place she has never been, or remembering a language she never learned to speak. This recognition creates its own magnetic field. People who are hungry for genuine connection are drawn to those who offer it. Not the connection that promises to fill all voids and answer all needs, but the connection that says, I am real. I see that you are real. Let us be real together in a world that often demands we be anything but. She begins to understand that her previous magnetism had been based on deficit, her own lack of self-worth, drawing those who were equally hungry for validation. It was a closed system, a mutual vampirism, disguised as love. But authentic presence operates from surplus, from the abundance of someone who has found her own center and can therefore offer genuine gifts rather than desperate sacrifices. The people who remain in her orbit after this transformation are different. They are not there to feed on her energy or to use her as an emotional dumping ground. They are there because they recognize something in her that speaks to their own deepest longings, the longing to be seen, to be met, to be known, not for what they produce or provide, but for the irreducible mystery of who they are. These relationships require less maintenance because they are built on solid ground rather than the shifting sands of mutual need. They can withstand disagreement because they are not based on the fantasy of endless harmony. They can survive conflict because they are rooted in genuine regard rather than performative niceness. She discovers that authentic magnetism is not about being more attractive or more charming or more anything. It is about being more real and Reality, she learns, has a quality that fantasy can never match. It can be trusted. When someone shows up as themselves, without the layers of pretense and performance, they offer others something rare in a world of masks and mirrors: the experience of meeting another human being. This does not mean she becomes selfish or indifferent to others' needs. Rather, her care becomes more conscious, more chosen, more sustainable. Like a well that is no longer being drained faster than it can refill, she has resources to offer from abundance rather than emptiness. Her giving becomes gift rather than compulsion, and gifts freely given carry entirely different energy than sacrifices grudgingly made. The mirror she once held up to reflect others' best selves is replaced by something more valuable: her own authentic reflection. In seeing her be courageously herself, others glimpse the possibility of their own authenticity. In witnessing her refuse to abandon herself for the sake of approval, they receive permission to do the same. This is the true magnetism of authentic presence. It does not pull others toward it to consume them, but to inspire them. It does not promise to be their salvation, but to be their companion on the path. It does not offer completion, but communion, and in that communion, something entirely new becomes possible, not the merging of two incompletions trying to become whole through each other, but the meeting of two wholes choosing to share their abundance. She walks differently now, with the quiet confidence of someone who has found her own ground. Her presence in a room is no longer the anxious seeking of someone hungry for validation, but the calm offering of someone who has something genuine to share. She listens differently too, not for what people need her to be, but for who they actually are beneath their own performances. And in this listening, in this being, in this simple radical act of showing up as herself, she creates a field of possibility around her. Others sense it and are drawn not by need, but by recognition, not by hunger, but by resonance. They come not to take, but to exchange, not to consume, but to commune. This is how the soul learns to magnetize, not through depletion, but through authenticity, not through performance, but through presence. This is how we discover that the very thing we thought would drive everyone away, our real, imperfect, gloriously human selves, is actually the only thing that can draw the right people home. In the sudden absence of what was once so dependably present, a different kind of seeing begins. Where there was once the steady reflection of someone who held up mirrors to show others their best selves, now there is only the stark honesty of what remains when that mirror is withdrawn. And in that withdrawal, those who took such devoted presence for granted are forced to confront a truth as uncomfortable as it is undeniable. They had been living in a house of mirrors, mistaking the reflected light for the source itself. The recognition comes not all at once, but in waves, like the delayed understanding that follows a sudden loss. At first, there is only the vague sense that something essential has shifted, that some familiar comfort has been withdrawn. The easy availability of understanding, the soft place to fall when the world felt harsh, the voice that always found something good to say about their choices, all of this simply ceases to be offered with the same unreflecting generosity. But the human psyche is remarkably adaptable in its capacity for self-deception. The initial response is often irritation rather than insight, annoyance rather than appreciation. How dare she become unavailable? How dare she stop being the reliable source of validation and support they had grown accustomed to receiving? The entitlement reveals itself like a wound exposed to air, raw and angry, and surprised by its own existence. Yet irritation cannot sustain itself indefinitely when faced with genuine absence. Like a child throwing a tantrum in an empty room, the complaints and demands eventually exhaust themselves against the silence. And in that silence, a different kind of awareness begins to dawn. The mirror she once held has not simply been turned away, It has been replaced by one that reflects reality with a clarity they are not prepared to face. This is the mirror of regret, and it shows them not who they thought they were, but who they revealed themselves to be through their actions and assumptions. In its reflection, they see the casual way they consumed her attention, the thoughtless manner in which they deposited their problems at her feet, the unconscious certainty that her care would always be there, renewable as air and just as taken for granted. The mirror shows them moments they had forgotten or never truly noticed, the times they called only when they needed something, the conversations that were monologues disguised as dialogue, the way they would brighten when she praised them and grow distant when she needed the same recognition in return. It reflects back the countless small betrayals that seem insignificant in isolation but accumulate like sediment in the soul's riverbed, eventually creating a dam that blocks the flow of genuine connection. Most painful of all, the mirror reveals their own complicity in reducing her to a function rather than honoring her as a person. They see how they learned to access her gifts without ever learning to know the giver, how they became expert in triggering her compulsive care without ever offering the same depth of attention in return. The relationship they had cherished was revealed to be a careful construction of their own neediness, meeting her inability to disappoint, a dance of mutual unconsciousness, dressed in the costume of love. This recognition arrives with the particular sting that accompanies belated understanding. Like realizing too late that what you mistook for a common stone was actually a rare gem, they are forced to confront not only what they lost through neglect, but what they failed to see while it was still within reach. The regret is not simply for her absence, but for their own blindness, their own capacity for taking the extraordinary and rendering it ordinary through inattention. The mirror shows them something else as well, their own poverty. Not material poverty, but the spiritual poverty of those who can only receive, who have never learned the art of genuine reciprocity. They see how they trained themselves to be takers in a relationship with someone who was trained to be a giver, creating a dynamic that was sustainable only as long as one person was willing to sacrifice herself on the altar of the other's comfort. In her absence, they are forced to face needs they had forgotten they possessed, the need for understanding, for patience, for someone who could see past their surface irritations to the fears and longings beneath. They discover that they had been living as emotional children, assuming that care and attention would simply materialize when needed, like food appearing on the table without thought to who prepared it or at what cost. The regret deepens as they realize how little they actually knew her. They could recite their own problems, their own struggles, their own dreams with exquisite detail, but when pressed to describe hers, they discover vast territories of ignorance. They had been so busy being seen by her that they had never learned to see her, so focused on being understood that they had never sought to understand. This ignorance reveals itself as a kind of violence, not the dramatic violence of attack, but the subtle violence of erasure. In treating her as a function rather than a person, they had participated in her disappearance even while she was still present. They had loved what she could do for them, while remaining largely indifferent to who she was when she wasn't doing anything at all. The mirror reflects their assumptions back with merciless clarity, that her care was somehow natural rather than chosen, that her patience was bottomless rather than finite, that her investment in their well-being required no reciprocal investment from them. They had confused her generosity with an absence of need, her strength with an absence of vulnerability, her giving with an absence of her own legitimate desires for receiving. Some flee from this reflection, turning away from the uncomfortable truths it reveals. They tell themselves stories about how she was manipulative or demanding or unreasonable, how her withdrawal is evidence of character flaws they had been too generous to see before. But these stories have the hollow ring of self-justification, and they know it even as they tell them. Others, however, find themselves unable to look away from what the mirror shows. They are haunted by memories that have taken on new meaning in the light of her absence. Her face when she was listening to their problems, the way she would brighten when they actually asked about her day, the rare moments when she let her own needs show through the careful construction of her care for others. They remember small things that now seem enormous. How she would remember details about their lives that they had forgotten sharing, how she would check in when they were going through difficult times, how she would celebrate their successes with a joy that seemed disproportionate, until they realized it was the joy of someone who had learned to find her own happiness in the happiness of others. The regret becomes a strange kind of education. They learn to see past their own navels, to consider the inner lives of others, not as abstract concepts, but as vivid realities. They discover that the people they had categorized as strong, or together, or naturally giving, were actually human, beings with their own struggles, their own needs for recognition and care. But perhaps the most profound revelation reflected in this mirror is their own capacity for blindness. They see how they had constructed elaborate justifications for their taking. She seemed to enjoy giving. She never complained. She always said it was fine. They had mistaken her inability to disappoint for genuine consent, her compulsive care. For freely offered love. The mirror shows them something that is both shameful and liberating. They are capable of change. The same unconsciousness that allowed them to take her for granted is not a fixed character trait, but a learned pattern. They can unlearn it. They can develop the capacity to see, to appreciate, to reciprocate. But this development requires something they had not previously offered. Genuine effort. Some discover they are not willing to make this effort, that they prefer to find another source of unreflected care rather than learn to offer care in return. But others find in this recognition the beginning of something resembling wisdom. They understand, perhaps for the first time, that relationships are not natural resources to be exploited, but gardens that require tending from all participants. The regret they feel is not simply personal, but archetypal. It is the regret of anyone who has ever taken the sun for granted until the day it failed to rise, who has ever assumed that the ocean would always be there until the day they found themselves in the desert. It is the regret of the unconscious when forced to confront the consequences of unconsciousness. In this confrontation, some find only loss and self-recrimination. But others discover something more valuable, the possibility of redemption. Not the easy redemption of apology and return to the old patterns, but the difficult redemption of genuine transformation. They learn that the only way to honor what they lost through neglect is to become capable of recognizing such gifts when they appear again. The mirror of regret, for all its painful revelations, offers something precious, the opportunity to see clearly, and in seeing clearly to choose differently, to love consciously rather than unconsciously, to appreciate presence while it is present rather than only in its absence. To become worthy of the extraordinary by learning to see it when it is disguised as the ordinary. This is the strange gift that emerges from the ashes of regret. The capacity to recognize preciousness before it is lost, to offer appreciation before it is too late, to see the person behind the function and the heart behind the service. It is a gift that comes at great cost, but for those willing to receive it, it transforms not only how they see her, but how they see everyone. In the deepest cavern of transformation, where the last echoes of who you once were finally fall silent, there comes a moment, sacred and terrible, when you must choose between the familiar ashes of your former self and the unknown fire of what you might become. This is not the gentle dawn of gradual awakening, but the fierce eruption of a soul that has touched its own bedrock and found there not emptiness, not the hollow validation you once sought in mirrors held by others, but something far more precious. The molten gold of your own inherent worth. You have descended through layers of borrowed identity, peeled away the costumes of pleasing and performing, shed the skin of self-abandonment that once felt as natural as breathing. In that descent, you discovered the curious alchemy by which a soul learns to burn with its own light, rather than reflecting the flickering approval of a world that was never designed to hold your true measure. The phoenix does not rise because the ashes are comfortable. It rises because something within the destruction remembers flight, not the desperate flutter of seeking approval, but the deep, certain wing beat of a creature that knows its own sky. This is where you find yourself now, in this sacred conflagration, where the old ways of measuring your worth have been consumed, leaving only the essential fire that was always yours to tend. There was a time when you believed your value was a currency that others minted, when you stood at the scales of worthiness with your heart extended, waiting for the world's appraisal. You learned to read the subtle mathematics of approval, how to calculate your standing through sideways glances and weighted silences, how to parse your worth from the careful distribution of others' attention. You became fluent in the language of external validation, a tongue that left your own voice perpetually foreign to you. But currencies crash, and even the most careful accounting of others' approval yields only the poverty of a self constantly negotiated, constantly conditional. The mirror of the world, you discovered, is a funhouse of distortions, reflecting back not truth, but projection, not your essence, but the fears and desires of those who look upon you. To base your value on such reflections is to build your house upon shifting sand, to trust your weight to bridges that were never meant to bear the full substance of a human soul. The phoenix knows this ancient truth, that to rise, you must first burn away everything that was never yours to begin with. The terse flames that consume your old self-abandonment are not punishment, but purification. Not destruction, but revelation. In the fire, you discover what cannot be burned, that core of worth that exists independent of witness, that essential value that shines with its own light rather than borrowing luminescence from others' approval. This is the great paradox of self-value. It emerges not from accumulation, but from subtraction. Not from adding layers of external validation, but from stripping away everything that obscures the original worth that was yours from the moment you drew breath. Like a sculptor who discovers the angel already present in the marble, you uncover your inherent value, not by creating it, but by ceasing to deny it, not by earning it, but by remembering it. The journey to this, remembering, is neither linear nor gentle. It requires you to walk through the wasteland of every moment you chose others' comfort over your own truth, to witness without flinching the archaeology of your own self-betrayal. You must excavate the buried agreements you made with unworthiness, those silent contracts that promised acceptance in exchange for the gradual erosion of your own center. In the shadow work of this transformation, you encounter the parts of yourself that learned to negotiate with diminishment, that became skilled in the dark art of making yourself smaller to fit into spaces that were never meant to contain you. You meet the inner voices that whisper the old liturgies of not enoughness, that recite with practiced precision all the ways you have failed to measure up to some impossible standard of worthy existence. But here, in the crucible of your becoming, you learn to hear these voices not as truth-tellers, but as echoes from a time when you believed love was earned rather than received, when you thought your place in the world was a privilege to be purchased rather than a birthright to be claimed. The phoenix of self-value does not silence these voices through force, but transforms them through fire, burning away their power to define you while leaving behind the wisdom they carry about the price of self-abandonment. This transformation is not the ego's inflation, but the soul's recognition of its own essential nature. There is no arrogance in the sun's decision to shine, no pride in the river's commitment to its course. Your intrinsic worth is not a trophy to be polished, but a fact to be accepted, not an achievement to be celebrated, but a reality to be lived. It simply is, like gravity or the turning of seasons, like the ocean's depth or the mountain's patient presence. Yet to live from this knowing requires a radical rewiring of the neural pathways carved by years of seeking validation outside yourself. You must learn to navigate a world that profits from your self-doubt, that depends upon your belief that worth is scarce and must be competed for. The phoenix of self-value rises into a sky filled with voices that would convince you to return to the ashes, that would persuade you your light is too bright, your presence too much, your worth too boldly claimed. This is where the deep work of individuation meets the practical challenge of embodiment. How do you carry this unshakable knowing of your own value into rooms where others expect you to diminish? How do you maintain the fire of self-worth in the face of systems designed to make you doubt your own luminescence? The phoenix does not rise to hide its light under bushels, but to burn with such clarity that others remember their own capacity for flight. The quiet confidence that emerges from this inner fire is not the brittle certainty of the ego, but the soft strength of someone who has touched the core of being and found it good. It does not need to announce itself through grand gestures or defensive postures. It moves through the world with the unhurried grace of deep knowing, like a tree whose roots have found the water table and no longer strains toward every passing cloud for sustenance. This confidence confuses those who are accustomed to your old patterns of seeking approval. They may interpret your self-possession as rejection, your wholeness as abandonment of them. The phoenix's flight can appear as betrayal to those who benefited from your groundedness, who fed on your need for their validation. But you learn that your worth is not negotiable, not subject to referendum, not dependent upon the comfort level of others with your transformed presence. In the mythology of your own becoming, you discover that the phoenix does not rise from ashes once, but cycles through this transformation again and again, each iteration burning away more of what was never essential, revealing more of what has always been true. Your self-value deepens not through accumulation of proof, but through progressive shedding of everything that would obscure your original worth. The fire that transforms you is not the harsh flame of self-criticism, but the warm light of self-compassion. You learn to tend your own worth with the gentle attention you might give to a flame in a monastery, protecting it from the winds of others' opinions while feeding it with the fuel of authentic choice. You become the guardian of your own value, the keeper of your own flame, the tender of your own sacred fire. This is not the solitary arrogance of the ego, but the connected confidence of someone who knows their place in the larger web of being. Your worth is not diminished by the worth of others. Their value does not threaten yours. The phoenix that rises from the ashes of self-abandonment carries no need to dim other lights to shine more brightly. It burns with the understanding that worth is not zero-sum, that the universe is abundant enough to hold the full magnificence of every soul without shortage. From this place of inner knowing, your relationships transform. You no longer enter connections as a beggar seeking validation, but as a whole being offering authentic presence. You discover that people are drawn to this quality of self-possession, that your unshakable knowing of your own worth gives others permission to remember theirs. The phoenix of self-value does not rise in isolation, but lifts the very air around it, creating thermals on which other souls might find their own flight. The practical implications of this transformation ripple through every aspect of your existence. You make choices from abundance rather than scarcity, from self-respect rather than self-abandonment. You no longer accept treatment that contradicts your inherent worth, no longer tolerate relationships that require you to shrink to accommodate others' discomfort with your light. The boundaries you set are not walls, but membranes, permeable to love while filtering out what would diminish your essential fire. In your work, you bring this quality of unshakable self-value, offering your gifts from fullness rather than need. You no longer perform for approval, but create from authentic expression. Your contributions carry the weight of someone who knows their own worth, and therefore can offer genuine value to the world. The phoenix does not fly to prove it can, but because flight is its nature. Yet perhaps the most profound transformation is in your relationship with solitude, where once you might have feared being alone with yourself, worried about what you might find in the silence, you now discover that your own company is not only bearable, but delightful. The phoenix of self-value carries no need for constant external confirmation, because it has learned to recognize its own light, to appreciate its own song, to find in its own presence a companionship that is both challenging and comforting. This does not mean you become isolated or self-sufficient in the brittle way of defended independence. Rather, you discover that your connections with others deepen when they arise from choice rather than need, when they spring from the overflow of your fullness rather than the emptiness of your seeking. You love more freely because you are no longer trying to earn love through your loving. You give more generously because you are no longer keeping careful account of what returns to you. The fire that burns within you now is not the desperate flame of seeking, but the steady light of being. It illuminates not only your own path, but casts warmth into the lives of those around you. People feel safer in your presence because they sense that your worth is not threatened by theirs, that your light is not diminished by their brightness. In your unshakable knowing of your own value, others catch glimpses of their own forgotten magnificence. This transformation is not a destination, but a deepening, not an achievement, but a remembering. Each day, you must choose again to rise from the ashes of old patterns, to burn away what would diminish your knowing of your own worth. The phoenix of self-value is not crowned once, but reborn continuously, each iteration revealing more of the inexhaustible treasure that has always resided at your core. As you move through the world from this place of inner knowing, you carry with you the radical gift of your own wholeness. You become living proof that worth is not earned but recognized, not created but uncovered, not achieved but remembered. Your very presence whispers to other souls the ancient truth they have forgotten, that they too carry within them a light that needs no external fuel, a worth that exists independent of witness, a value as constant and reliable as the beating of their own heart. The phoenix that has risen from the ashes of your former self, abandonment flies now with wings of pure recognition, carrying in its flight the knowledge that you are valuable not because of what you do or achieve or become, but because you are. This worth is your birthright, your inheritance, your sacred responsibility to honor and protect. It shines with the quiet confidence of deep knowing, illuminating not only your own path forward, but lighting the way for all who are ready to remember their own forgotten fire. In the sacred silence that follows great dissolution, something unprecedented begins to stir. Not the familiar pattern of rebuilding what was, but the birth of something entirely new. She who has walked through the valley of her own shadow, who has witnessed the death of every mask she once wore to earn her place in the world, now stands at the threshold of a different kind of existence. The old contracts lie in ashes at her feet. Those invisible agreements she had signed with existence itself, written in the blood of endless giving, sealed with the surrender of her own sacred energy. But now, In this space between who she was and who she is becoming, she takes up a different kind of pen, not the one that trembles with anxiety to please, not the one that scrawls desperate amendments to agreements that were never meant to honor her soul, but a golden stylus that channels the wisdom of her newly integrated self. She begins to write new covenants with life itself, contracts that arise not from fear of abandonment, but from the deep knowing of her own worth. These new agreements emerge from the marriage of her ego and herself, that sacred union Jung spoke of, where the small, grasping aspects of personality finally bow to the larger wisdom of the soul. She writes with the authority of one who has descended into her own underworld and returned bearing the treasures of authentic selfhood. Each word she inscribes carries the weight of lived experience, the gravitas of one who has learned that her energy is not renewable through will alone, but sacred and finite, deserving of the most careful stewardship. The first covenant she writes is with time itself. No longer will she offer her hours as if they were infinite, as if her presence in the world carried no weight or meaning. She understands now what the alchemists knew, that time is the crucible in which consciousness transforms, and hers has been too long spent in service to transformations that were not her own. She declares that her time is precious beyond measure, not because she hoards it in miserly fashion, but because she recognizes it as the raw material of her own becoming. In this new agreement, she no longer appears at every summoning, no longer bends her schedule into impossible shapes to accommodate the needs of others, while her own dreams languish in neglect. She moves with the measured pace of one who understands that presence is a gift, not an obligation. When she chooses to give her time, it flows from abundance rather than anxiety, from the overflow of a well-tended soul rather than the desperate emptying of a cup that never knows refilling. The second covenant speaks to the sacred nature of her energy itself. She who once poured herself out like wine at a wedding that never honored her participation now understands that her life force is not a commodity to be traded for acceptance. Her energy carries the signature of her unique soul, the particular frequency of her individual path toward wholeness. To scatter it carelessly is to commit a form of sacrilege against her own divine nature. She writes of boundaries not as walls built in hostility, but as sacred circles drawn in love for her own capacity to contribute meaningfully to the world. Within these circles, her energy gathers strength, deepens in quality, becomes potent with the power of careful cultivation. She learns to say no with the tenderness of a gardener who refuses to plant seeds in soil that cannot nourish them, knowing that such refusal serves not only her own growth, but the authentic flowering of all involved. This new relationship with her energy transforms how she moves through the world. No longer does she arrive at gatherings depleted before they begin, having spent her vitality in the anxiety of preparation and the exhaustion of self-doubt. Instead, she comes carrying her own weather, her own climate of centered presence. She brings what Jung called the transcendent function, that mysterious capacity to hold opposing energies in creative tension, to be both vulnerably open and wisely protected. The third covenant addresses the nature of her love itself. Perhaps nowhere has the old mythology done more damage than in its insistence that love proves itself through suffering, through the endless willingness to give without receiving, through the gradual disappearance of self in service to the beloved. She rewrites this ancient story with the authority of one who has loved unto dissolution and discovered that such love serves no one truly. In her new agreement with existence, love becomes not a debt to be paid, but a gift to be shared. She loves now as the sun loves, not because it must prove its worth to the planets, but because warmth and light are its natural emanation. Her love flows from the fullness of her being rather than the emptiness of her need. It carries no hidden contracts, no unspoken expectations of reciprocity measured in kind. When she loves, it is an offering of her authentic self, not a loan that accumulates interest in the form of unmet expectations. This transformed understanding of love creates ripples throughout all her relationships. She no longer loves in the desperate way of one who fears abandonment, clinging and grasping and shaping herself into whatever form might guarantee permanence. Instead, she loves with the confidence of one who has learned that her value does not depend on being chosen by others, but on choosing herself first, and most completely. The fourth covenant concerns the territory of mutual respect. She declares that any relationship worthy of her investment must meet her in this new landscape she has discovered, a place where giving and receiving flow in natural rhythms rather than the exhausting imbalance she once accepted as normal. This is not the calculating reciprocity of scorekeeping, but the organic exchange that happens when two people recognize each other's inherent worth. In this territory, she need not diminish herself to make others comfortable with their own limitations. She need not hide her light to avoid triggering another's shadow, nor apologize for the strength she has earned through her descent into her own darkness. She stands in her full dimensionality, and those who cannot meet her there reveal themselves as unsuited for genuine intimacy. This new territory requires courage, both to establish and to maintain. The old patterns cry out for return, the familiar grooves of self-betrayal beckon with their false promise of peace through surrender. But she has tasted something too precious to abandon, the wild freedom of being herself without apology, the fierce joy of giving from overflow rather than deficit. The fifth covenant addresses appreciation, that often overlooked necessity of the soul. She who once accepted crumbs of acknowledgement as if they were banquets now understands that genuine appreciation is as essential to her flourishing as sunlight to a flower. But this appreciation she seeks is not the hollow praise that comes from performing someone else's expectations of who she should be. Instead, she desires the recognition that comes from being truly seen in her authentic essence. She writes into existence the expectation that her unique gifts will be received with gratitude rather than taken for granted. This is not vanity, but wisdom, the understanding that appreciation is the natural response to authentic gift-giving. When her contributions are met with indifference or casual assumption, she recognizes this as information about the relationship rather than evidence of her own inadequacy. The sixth covenant speaks to the end of the endless audition. No more will she live as if she must constantly prove her right to exist in others' lives. No more will she accept the exhausting role of the one who must always demonstrate her worthiness through ever-escalating acts of service or self-sacrifice. She declares herself finished with earning her place through the abandonment of her own needs. This covenant emerges from the deep cellular knowing that her worth is inherent, written into the very fabric of her being by the same force that spins galaxies and awakens flowers. She needs no external validation to confirm what has always been true, that she belongs to the cosmos as surely as the stars belong to the sky. Her presence is not a privilege she must earn, but a gift she chooses to share. Those who wish to remain in her life must meet her in this new understanding. They must be willing to see her as she truly is, rather than as they need her to be. They must be prepared to receive her gifts with genuine appreciation rather than casual expectation. Most importantly, they must be capable of their own authentic giving, their own vulnerable sharing of who they are beneath the masks and roles. Some will rise to meet her in this new territory. These relationships will deepen into something previously unknown, connections based on mutual recognition rather than mutual need, on the celebration of each other's becoming rather than the fear of each other's changing. With these souls, She will discover what Jung meant by genuine relationship, the meeting of two individuated beings who choose each other not from compulsion, but from the joy of recognized kinship. Others will reveal their inability or unwillingness to meet her in this authentic space. They will attempt to negotiate her back into the familiar patterns, to convince her that her new boundaries are selfish, that her transformed expectations are unreasonable. They will speak the language of obligation and duty, of how things have always been and should always remain. Their discomfort with her metamorphosis will be the very evidence she needs of why the old agreements no longer serve. She learns to observe these responses with the compassionate detachment of one who understands that each soul moves at its own pace toward consciousness. She does not take their inability to meet her as personal rejection, nor does she allow their discomfort to become the reason for her return to unconsciousness. Instead, she holds space for the natural sorting that occurs when authentic boundaries are established. When real standards are applied to the relationships in her life, the new covenants she writes are not rigid demands, but living documents, capable of growth and refinement as she continues her journey toward wholeness. They evolve as she evolves, deepening in wisdom as her self-knowledge expands. But their foundation remains constant, the unshakable recognition of her own sacred worth and the absolute necessity of honoring that worth in all her dealings with the world. In the silence of her transformed understanding, she begins to attract different kinds of people into her orbit. Those who are themselves on the path of individuation recognize a kindred spirit. They appreciate her authenticity because it gives them permission for their own. They celebrate her boundaries because they understand the courage required to establish them. They meet her gift-giving with their own generous offerings, creating the kind of reciprocal flow that nourishes rather than depletes. These new covenants with life create what Jung might have called a temenos, a sacred space within which transformation can continue to unfold. Within the protection of her wisely established boundaries, she discovers aspects of herself that could never emerge in the old paradigm of endless giving. Creativity flowers in the soil of carefully tended energy. Wisdom deepens in the silence of no longer needing to speak constantly to prove her worth. Joy bubbles up from the well of a soul that finally knows its own value. The days of earning her place through endless giving have ended forever, not through bitter renunciation, but through the natural maturation of consciousness itself. She has learned what the mystics have always known, that the divine does not require our diminishment as proof of our devotion, but rather calls us to the fullness of our being as the highest form of sacred offering. In choosing herself first and most completely, she becomes capable of loving others in a way that truly serves their highest good, rather than merely meeting their immediate needs. Her new covenants with life stand as monuments to the possibility of transformation, beacons for all who still wander in the wilderness of self-abandonment. They declare that another way is possible, that the feminine principle need not sacrifice itself on the altar of others' comfort, that worth is inherent rather than earned. In the living of these new agreements, she becomes both the author and the protagonist of a different kind of love story, one where the greatest romance is between the soul and its own magnificent becoming. In the aftermath of her great death, that profound dissolution of the self who proved her worth through endless giving, she stands now in the sacred space between worlds, surveying the landscape of her former life with eyes that have been washed clean by tears and polished bright by truth. Before her lies a graveyard of relationships, some recently buried beneath the weight of their own dysfunction, others long dead but never properly mourned. Each grave marker bears the name of a connection that could not survive her transformation, that withered when exposed to the light of her newly established boundaries. But graves, she has learned, are not always final resting places. Some hold seeds that wait in darkness for the right season of return. Others contain only dust and the echo of what never truly was. The wisdom that now flows through her consciousness, earned through descent and resurrection, purchased with the coin of her own becoming, carries the most precious gift of discernment, the ability to distinguish between what deserves the miracle of resurrection and what must remain buried in the soil of her past. This discernment does not come easily or without cost. It requires her to become an archaeologist of her own experience, carefully excavating the remains of each relationship to determine what was real and what was merely the projection of her own desperate need to be needed. She must sift through the debris of old connections with the patient hands of one who knows that fool's gold glitters as brightly as the genuine article, that the desperate heart can mistake even the cruelest indifference for love if it is sufficiently starved for affection. As she moves through this landscape of relational archaeology, she carries with her the hard-won knowledge of what Jung called the transcendent function, that mysterious capacity to hold opposite truths in creative tension without being torn apart by their contradiction. She can now hold both her love for someone and her recognition of their inability to truly see her. She can embrace both her desire for connection and her commitment to her own wholeness. This is not the splitting of the unconscious mind that sees only black or white, but the mature integration that perceives the subtle gradations of grey that color all human relationships. The first category of connections she encounters in her survey are those relationships that were built entirely on her willingness to disappear. These were not true intimacies, but elaborate theatre pieces in which she played the role of the supporting character in everyone else's drama. She provided the steady applause, the reliable emotional labor, the endless supply of attention and validation that allowed others to maintain their starring roles without ever having to reciprocate with genuine interest in her inner world. These relationships reveal themselves now in all their hollow poverty. Stripped of her constant investment of energy, they collapse like houses built on sand, unable to stand without the foundation of her self-sacrifice. She sees clearly now how these connections never required her authentic self. Indeed, how her authenticity would have been an inconvenience, a complication to the smooth functioning of their one-sided dynamic. In the graveyard of such relationships, she places markers not of regret, but of recognition. These connections served their purpose in the grand curriculum of her soul's education, teaching her what love is not, showing her the difference between being valued for who she is and being useful for what she provides. Their ending is not tragedy but graduation, not failure, but the natural conclusion of a chapter that had already been written in invisible ink. But as her survey continues, she discovers other kinds of graves, relationships that died, not because they were fundamentally false, but because they could not survive the earthquake of her transformation while remaining in their old form. These are the connections that held genuine affection, real shared history, moments of authentic intimacy that existed within containers too small and too rigid to accommodate her expanding consciousness. Here, her discernment must become even more refined. She must learn to separate the wheat from the chaff, to distinguish between relationships that died because they were built on mutual unconsciousness and those that perished because one party outgrew the agreed-upon limitations, while the other was not yet ready for such expansion. The latter category holds the possibility of resurrection, but only if both parties are willing to meet in entirely new territory. This is where her newly developed capacity for what Jung called active imagination becomes essential. She must be able to envision what these relationships could become, if they were rebuilt on the foundation of mutual respect and authentic seeing. She must also honestly assess whether the other party possesses the consciousness and willingness necessary for such reconstruction. This requires her to see people not as she wishes them to be, not as they have the potential to become, but as they actually are in this moment. With all their current limitations and capacities, the wisdom of selective return teaches her that not everyone who claims to miss her is actually missing her. Many are simply missing the version of her that served their unconscious needs, the carefully curated self she presented that required no real intimacy or reciprocity from them. Their calls for reunion are often disguised attempts to reinstall the old operating system, to convince her to return to the familiar patterns that kept them comfortable while keeping her small. She learns to listen, not just to what people say, but to what they offer. Do they approach her with genuine curiosity about who she has become, or do they immediately attempt to place her back into the familiar boxes of who they remember? Do they express real remorse for the ways they took her for granted, or do they minimize the significance of her departure with casual explanations and surface-level apologies? Do they demonstrate through actions their willingness to meet her in the new territory she has established, or do they negotiate for a return to the old familiar ground? The art of selective return requires her to become fluent in the language of energetic exchange. She must be able to sense whether someone approaches her with the intention of genuine reconnection or with the unconscious agenda of restoration to previous dynamics. This sensing happens not primarily through words, for words can lie both to others and to the speaker themselves, but through the subtle energetics of presence, through the quality of attention someone brings to the interaction. Those who are worthy of resurrection reveal themselves through specific qualities that cannot be manufactured or performed. They demonstrate genuine curiosity about her journey, asking questions that arise from real interest rather than polite convention. They express authentic appreciation for the person she has become, recognizing the courage it took for her to choose herself over the familiar comfort of self-abandonment. They offer their own vulnerability in return, sharing their own struggles with authenticity and growth rather than maintaining the safe distance of casual conversation. Most importantly, they show up with something to offer rather than approaching her primarily as a source of what they need. They have done their own work of examining how they may have contributed to the dysfunction of the old dynamic. They come bearing gifts of their own transformation, their own hard-won insights, their own commitment to creating something more real and sustainable than what existed before. But even among those who meet these criteria, she must exercise the deepest discernment of all. For some relationships, even when both parties have grown and changed, carry within their history such patterns of wounding that attempting to resurrect them serves no one. Sometimes the most loving act is to honor what was beautiful in the connection, while allowing it to remain complete in its ending. This is perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the wisdom of selective return, recognizing that some relationships are meant to be perfect in their incompleteness, teaching what they came to teach and then gracefully exiting the stage of her life. To attempt to force their continuation beyond their natural conclusion would be to dishonor the sacred timing of soul growth, to try to stretch a cocoon that has already fulfilled its purpose and split open to allow the butterfly's emergence. She discovers that this wisdom applies not only to romantic relationships, but to friendships, family connections, and professional associations. Each category requires its own specific form of discernment. Family relationships, bound by blood and history, often demand the most nuanced navigation. Some family members may never be capable of seeing her as anything other than the role she played in the family system, yet the connection may still hold value if she can maintain her boundaries while engaging with realistic expectations. Friendships may require complete reconstruction or may need to be gently released, depending on the foundation upon which they were originally built. Professional relationships may need to be compartmentalized, maintained in their appropriate sphere, while no longer bleeding into her personal energy reserves. The process of selective return teaches her that discernment is not cruelty, but the highest form of love. Love for her own continued growth, and love for others that honors their truth, rather than her fantasy of who they might become. When she chooses to reinvest in a relationship, she does so with clear eyes and an open heart, offering her authentic self while requiring nothing less than authenticity in return. Those relationships that prove worthy of resurrection often become deeper and more satisfying than they ever were in their previous incarnation. Built on the foundation of mutual respect and genuine seeing, they create space for both parties to continue growing and changing without threatening the connection itself. They become what Jung might have called temenos relationships, sacred containers within which continued transformation can unfold safely. But she also learns to celebrate the relationships that remain buried, honoring them for the role they played in her development without needing them to continue indefinitely. Some connections are seasonal, meant to bloom and flourish, and then naturally fade as circumstances and consciousness change. Others are meant to burn bright and brief, like shooting stars that illuminate the sky for a moment before dissolving into the darkness from which they came. The wisdom of selective return ultimately teaches her that she is not obligated to maintain every connection that once brought her joy, nor to resurrect every relationship that claims to miss her presence. Her energy has become too precious, her time too sacred, her love too refined to pour into vessels that cannot hold the fullness of who she has become. In exercising this wisdom, she becomes a curator of her own life, carefully selecting which relationships deserve space in the gallery of her attention, and which must be respectfully retired to the archives of memory. This curation is not performed with coldness or calculation, but with the warm discernment of one who has learned that saying yes to everything means saying yes to nothing fully. She moves forward carrying only those connections that enhance rather than diminish her, that celebrate rather than merely tolerate her transformation, that offer reciprocity rather than endless extraction. In this selective return to relationship, she discovers that having fewer connections of greater depth serves her soul far more than maintaining numerous relationships of surface-level pleasantness. The graveyard of her former life becomes not a place of mourning but a garden of wisdom, each ended relationship composting into the rich soil from which her new life grows. She tends this garden with the patience of one who understands that both death and resurrection serve the eternal cycles of the soul's becoming. In choosing carefully what deserves the gift of her renewed attention, she honors both her own growth and the sacred mystery of human connection itself. In the sacred chamber of her solitude, where the echoes of her footsteps still reverberate from the great walking away, she begins to understand that her departure was never just a personal act of liberation. It was a seismic shift that created ripples through the collective unconscious, a stone thrown into the still waters of cultural assumption that continues to generate waves long after the initial impact. Her choice to leave, to simply, finally, irrevocably stop proving her worth through self-abandonment, has become something far larger than a single woman's journey toward wholeness. It has become a mythology, a teaching story written in the flesh and blood of lived experience. The legacy she leaves behind is not carved in marble or inscribed on bronze tablets, but etched into the very consciousness of all who witnessed her transformation. Her departure becomes a mirror held up to the world, reflecting back the unconscious agreements that govern how the feminine has been expected to exist. Always giving, always proving, always disappearing, just enough to make others comfortable with their own limitations. In walking away from these soul-crushing contracts, she exposes their existence to those who had never questioned their validity. This exposure is not comfortable. Like all true revelations, it disturbs the peace of unconsciousness, challenging those left behind to confront their own participation in systems of relational exploitation. Some will rise to meet this challenge, awakening to examine how they may have unconsciously relied on others' self-abandonment for their own comfort. Others will resist the invitation to consciousness, preferring to interpret her departure through the familiar lens of feminine irrationality or selfishness, rather than facing the more unsettling possibility that their expectations were unreasonable. From the beginning, but the seed has been planted, and seeds have their own mysterious timeline for germination. Her walking away creates what Jung would recognize as a constellation in the collective psyche, a gathering of psychic energy around the possibility that the feminine principle need not sacrifice itself to be worthy of love. This constellation exerts its own gravitational pull, drawing toward itself others who carry similar wounds, similar longings for a different way of being in relationship with the world. The mythology she leaves behind rewrites one of the oldest stories ever told, the story of feminine worth and how it is established. For millennia, the cultural narrative has insisted that women prove their value through endless giving, through the willingness to disappear their own needs in service to others' comfort, through the gradual erosion of self that masquerades as love, but is really a sophisticated form of suicide. Her departure from this narrative creates space for a new story to emerge, one where the feminine simply is, without need of external validation or constant performance of worthiness. This new mythology ripples outward through every relationship. She leaves behind, forcing each person to confront their own relationship with giving and receiving, with appreciation and entitlement, with presence and absence. Those who took her constant availability for granted must now grapple with the reality of her absence, learning perhaps for the first time what it means to truly miss someone rather than simply expecting their return. Those who benefited from her endless emotional labor must now discover whether they are capable of reciprocal intimacy or whether their connections were always parasitic in nature. The teaching embedded in her departure is profound in its simplicity, that self-worth cannot be negotiated and authentic love cannot be earned through self-abandonment. This lesson arrives not as an abstract philosophical concept, but as a lived reality, demonstrated through the undeniable evidence of her empty chair, her unanswered phone, her absence from the familiar routines where she once appeared like clockwork, to tend to everyone else's needs before her own. Her legacy becomes a form of what Jung called active imagination, made manifest in the world. A new vision of what feminine existence could look like when freed from the compulsive need to prove worthiness through sacrifice. She becomes a living demonstration that it is possible to love without losing oneself, to care without carrying the full weight of others' emotional worlds, to give without giving oneself away entirely. This demonstration sends shockwaves through the established order of relationships in her sphere of influence. Family systems that relied on her as the designated caretaker, the reliable one who could always be counted on to smooth over dysfunction and absorb others' unprocessed emotions, must now either evolve toward greater consciousness or reveal their true nature as systems built on exploitation rather than genuine love. Friendships that existed primarily as vehicles for others to process their lives, while showing little genuine interest in hers, must either transform into reciprocal connections or fade away entirely. the professional relationships that expected her to give beyond what was reasonable, to absorb toxic dynamics with endless patience, to prioritize others' comfort over her own well-being, must now confront the reality that such expectations were never sustainable. Her absence creates a vacuum that cannot be filled by simply finding another person willing to abandon themselves for the comfort of the collective unconscious. But perhaps the most profound aspect of her legacy lies not in what it teaches others, but in what it gives permission for. Her walking away becomes a beacon for other women who have spent lifetimes proving their worth through self-erasure, showing them that another way of being is not only possible but necessary for authentic existence. Her departure creates what mythologists call a rupture in the collective story, a crack in the wall of accepted reality through which new possibilities can enter. The permission she grants through her example is the permission to value oneself as highly as one values others, to expect reciprocity in relationships rather than accepting endless extraction, to trust that authentic love will not require the abandonment of one's essential self as proof of worthiness. This permission ripples outward through networks of connection, inspiring other women to examine their own patterns of self-sacrifice and question whether such sacrifice truly serves anyone's highest good. Her legacy becomes a form of soul midwifery, assisting in the birth of new ways of being feminine in the world. She demonstrates that strength need not be performed through endless endurance of mistreatment, that love need not be proven through the willingness to accept crumbs of affection as if they were feasts, that worthiness is inherent rather than earned through elaborate performances of selflessness. The mythology she creates challenges the very foundations of patriarchal relationship dynamics, but it does so not through angry protest or intellectual argument, but through the irrefutable evidence of a life lived differently. She becomes proof that it is possible to honor one's own needs without becoming selfish, to establish boundaries without becoming cruel, to choose oneself first and most completely while still maintaining the capacity for genuine love and service to others. This paradox that choosing oneself fully actually increases one's capacity to love authentically becomes one of the central teachings embedded in her legacy. Those who witness her transformation see that her departure from self-abandoning patterns has not made her cold or closed off, but rather more genuinely available for real intimacy. No longer depleted by the constant drain of proving her worth, she has energy available for the kinds of connections that nourish rather than extract, that celebrate rather than merely tolerate her authentic self. The ripple effects of her walking away extend beyond her immediate circle of relationships to touch the broader cultural conversation about feminine worth and masculine entitlement. Her example becomes part of a larger awakening happening across the globe as women everywhere begin to question the unspoken contracts that have governed their relationships with the world. Her individual journey toward wholeness contributes to a collective healing that transcends her personal story while remaining grounded in the specificity of her own experience. But the legacy she leaves is not without its challenges. Her departure forces everyone in her sphere to confront their own unconscious patterns, their own ways of relating that may have been built on exploitation rather than genuine exchange. This confrontation can be deeply uncomfortable, stirring up shadow material that has been carefully kept out of awareness. Some will blame her for the discomfort her absence creates, preferring to make her wrong rather than examining their own contributions to dysfunctional dynamics. Yet even this resistance becomes part of the teaching. Her willingness to be misunderstood, to be labeled as selfish or difficult by those who cannot recognize their own unconscious exploitation, demonstrates the courage required to live authentically in a world that often punishes such authenticity. She shows that the opinions of those who benefited from her self-abandonment need not determine her choices, that their comfort was never her responsibility in the first place. The new mythology she creates does not romanticize her journey or present it as easy or painless. She does not hide the loneliness that sometimes accompanies her choice to live more consciously, the grief that comes with letting go of relationships that could not evolve beyond their original limitations, the courage required to keep choosing herself even when that choice is met with criticism or rejection. By acknowledging these difficulties while still maintaining her commitment to authentic living, she creates a realistic template for others who might follow similar paths. Her legacy becomes a form of what depth psychology calls the transcendent, function writ large, a bridge between the old way of being feminine and a new way that honors both strength and softness, both giving and receiving, both service to others and loyalty to one's own soul. She demonstrates that it is possible to integrate these seemingly opposite qualities without being torn apart by their tension. That wholeness comes not from choosing one side or the other, but from learning to hold both in conscious balance. The teaching stories that emerge from her departure will be told and retold in the intimate conversations between women who recognize themselves in her journey. They will speak of her in the language of mythology, recognizing in her story the eternal patterns of death and rebirth that characterize all authentic transformation. She becomes an archetype for her time, the woman who remembered her own worth, who chose herself with the same dedication she had once brought to choosing others, who walked away from the familiar patterns of self-sacrifice to discover what lay beyond such limitation. Her legacy challenges the very notion of feminine service, transforming it from unconscious self-abandonment to conscious choice. She shows that true service to others flows from the overflow of a well-tended soul, not from the depletion of one who has never learned to honor her own needs. Her example inspires a new understanding of what it means to be generous, not through the endless giving of what one can barely afford to lose, but through the abundant sharing that comes from recognizing one's own fullness. In the years to come, the women will speak of the moment they realized they, too, had the right to walk away from relationships that required their diminishment as the price of admission. They will trace their own awakening to stories like hers, recognizing in her example the permission they needed to begin their own journey toward wholeness. Her departure becomes a catalyst for countless other departures, each one contributing to the collective healing of feminine relationship, to power, worth, and authentic love. The mythology she leaves behind insists that walking away can be the most profound act of love, love for oneself, love for others who deserve the gift of authentic relationship rather than the performance of endless accommodation, and love for the future generations who will inherit a world where feminine worth is recognized as inherent rather than earned through self-sacrifice. Her empty chair becomes a throne, her silence a profound teaching, her absence a presence more powerful than her previous self-abandoning availability ever was. In choosing to leave rather than continue the soul-crushing work of proving her worthiness, she demonstrates what Jung knew to be the ultimate goal of individuation, the courage to be oneself completely, without apology or accommodation, trusting that such authenticity serves the collective healing even when it challenges the collective comfort. The legacy of her walking away becomes legend, whispered in the spaces between women who are just beginning to remember their own worth, shared in the quiet moments when someone else finds the courage to value herself as highly as she values others. Her departure creates a new North Star in the constellation of feminine becoming, pointing the way toward a different kind of existence. One where love is expressed through presence rather than absence, where service flows from abundance rather than depletion, where walking away becomes the most sacred act of coming home to oneself.